They said Duke Cadric Reventhal never learned to smile after his father died screaming. The Northern Territories remembered that night 15 years ago when rebels dragged Duke Aldrich from Blackmere Keep and executed him in the courtyard while his 12-year-old son watched from a locked tower window. The boy's screams carried across the frozen cliffs until his voice shattered completely. By dawn, the rebellion had collapsed under royal forces, but something fundamental had broken inside the young heir. When servants finally unlocked the tower door, they found Caedric sitting motionless in darkness, eyes open but empty, as though his soul had followed his father into whatever cold place the dead inhabited. He never cried again. Not once. And men who knew him before swore the boy who entered that tower had never truly come back out. Now at 32, Duke Cadric ruled the North with the kind of absolute authority that made even the crown nervous. His reputation preceded him like winter storms rolling off the northern sea, brutal, merciless, incapable of warmth. Nobles who opposed him found their estates seized before sunrise. Merchants who cheated his tax collectors disappeared into Blackmere's dungeons and emerged months later as broken men who flinched at shadows. The Duke's justice was swift and public, designed not merely to punish, but to terrify anyone foolish enough to imagine defiance. But what the kingdom truly feared was not his cruelty, it was his absolute control. Cadric never acted from rage or impulse. Every execution, every political maneuver, every alliance forged or destroyed followed calculations so precise they seemed inhuman. He moved through court politics like a grandmaster playing chess against children, anticipating opposition before it fully formed and crushing it with surgical efficiency. Men whispered he had inherited his father's ambition but none of his mercy, that the trauma of watching Duke Aldrich die had carved out every soft part of his humanity and replaced it with something dark and calculating that understood only power and survival. The truth was simpler and far more devastating. Cadric had learned the fundamental lesson his father's assassination taught. Good men died while their enemies celebrated. Honor was a luxury that got you killed. And if the world wanted monsters to fear, then he would become the most terrifying monster the North had ever known. At least monsters survived. At least monsters never had to watch their loved ones bleed out in castle courtyards, while locked doors kept them from doing anything except scream. Blackmere Keep itself reflected its master's nature. The fortress rose from obsidian cliffs like something carved from the bones of the earth itself, all sharp angles and black stone that swallowed light instead of reflecting it. 6 towers punctured the northern sky, their peaks wrapped perpetually in storm clouds that refused to dissipate even during summer. The sea crashed against the rocks below with violence that sounded like continuous thunder, and the wind howling through the castle's corridors carried a coldness that had nothing to do with temperature. It was a place built for war, not comfort, a statement of dominance over the harsh northern landscape. The Duke's study occupied the highest chamber of the central tower, a room decorated with brutal simplicity. Dark wood furniture, maps covering every wall, a single window overlooking the frozen wasteland that stretched toward the horizon. No paintings, no tapestries. Nothing that suggested the man who lived here possessed interests beyond strategy and control. The massive desk dominating the space held documents arranged with obsessive precision, tax records, military reports, intelligence gathered from spies embedded throughout the kingdom. Everything categorized, everything weaponized. Cadric stood at that window now in the failing afternoon light, hands clasped behind his back, watching storm clouds gather over the northern mountains. His reflection in the glass revealed a man built from harsh lines and controlled violence. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of physical presence that made rooms feel smaller when he entered them. Dark hair cut short and practical, sharp features that would have been handsome if they ever softened into anything resembling warmth. But it was his eyes that people remembered afterward. Pale gray like winter ice, and just as devoid of mercy when he looked at you and calculated exactly how useful or dangerous you might be to his plans. He wore black, always black, as though still mourning his father 15 years later, or perhaps mourning the boy he had been before that night transformed him into this. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Sharp, precise. His steward Marcus understood that the Duke's time was measured in strategic value and wasted seconds annoyed him. Come in. Marcus entered with the efficient movements of a man who had served Caedric long enough to anticipate his moods. Middle-aged, competent, smart enough to fear his employer, but loyal enough to have survived a decade in Blackmere's brutal hierarchy. He carried documents that he placed on the desk with careful precision. The royal summons arrived an hour ago, my lord. The Crown requests your presence at the Winter Council in 3 weeks. Mandatory attendance for all territorial governors. Kedrick didn't turn from the window. They want to discuss the Northern Independence Movement. Marcus hesitated. That's not specified in the official correspondence, but yes, likely. The raids along the eastern border have made the king nervous. He'll want assurances that the northern territories remain loyal. The Duke smiled without humor. Loyal. As though loyalty meant anything to men who betrayed my father after he spent 20 years bleeding for their expansion wars. He finally turned from the window and moved to his desk, scanning the summons with quick efficiency. The language was diplomatic, but the subtext was clear. The Crown didn't trust him. They never had. Duke Aldrich's assassination might have been blamed on rebels, but Ceadric had spent years uncovering the truth. His father had been eliminated because he'd grown too powerful, too popular with the northern houses, too dangerous to a paranoid king who saw threats in every shadow. The rebellion had been allowed to succeed, perhaps even encouraged. And the 12-year-old boy locked in a tower had learned exactly what happened to men who trusted the Crown's protection. Now that same Crown wanted reassurances of loyalty from the son of the man they'd murdered. I'll attend. Send confirmation before sunset. Marcus nodded, but didn't leave. There's another matter. My lord, Lady Seraphina Vale arrived this morning under guard escort. She's been placed in the East Wing guest quarters, as you ordered. Kedrick's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air of the room, a tension that hadn't been there before. He set down the royal summons and looked at his steward with those ice-cold eyes that betrayed nothing. The daughter. Yes, my lord, Duke Vale's only child. The political arrangement you negotiated after his treason trial last month. She's here as... He paused, searching for diplomatic language, as collateral for her father's continued cooperation. Hostage, Marcus. The word you're avoiding is hostage. I don't deal in euphemisms. The steward shifted uncomfortably. Yes, my lord. Hostage. Ceadric moved to the window again, hands returning to their position clasped behind his back. Duke Alaric Vale had been planning a coordinated rebellion among the southern noble houses for 18 months. Detailed plans, foreign alliances, shipments of weapons disguised as merchant goods. It would have been the largest challenge to the Crown's authority in a generation. Ceadric's network of spies had uncovered everything and delivered it to him like a gift. The evidence alone could have seen Vale and his entire family executed publicly. Instead, Ceadric had made him an offer: complete submission, total cooperation. Every rebellious house in the south betrayed and delivered to the Duke's justice. And in exchange, Duke Vale kept his head and his titles. But trust needed insurance. Hence his daughter living at Blackmere under Ceadric's control, where her father's continued obedience could be guaranteed by the unspoken threat of what happened to hostages when their families proved disloyal. She's 23. Her husband died in a hunting accident 2 years ago. No children. Her reputation suggests intelligence and strong will. The Southern Court considers her somewhat dangerous. Apparently, she refused multiple marriage proposals from powerful houses after her husband's death, which her father found politically inconvenient. Ceadric's lip curved slightly. Dangerous. Men always call women dangerous when they refuse to behave as expected. Shall I arrange for you to meet with her this evening? Tomorrow. Let her settle into her new circumstances first. Make sure she understands the household rules and has everything she needs. She's a guest here, not a prisoner. Marcus nodded, but his expression suggested doubt about that distinction. The Duke noticed. Something you want to say? The steward chose his words carefully. The court will interpret this arrangement as provocative. Taking a duke's daughter as hostage rather than simply executing the traitor sends a particular message. It sends exactly the message I intend. That I'm more interested in useful outcomes than satisfying bloodlust. Vale is worth more to me alive and terrified than dead and martyred. His daughter ensures he remains both. And if she proves troublesome? Ceadric turned from the window, and his eyes held the kind of cold certainty that had made him the most feared man in the kingdom. Then I'll deal with her the same way I deal with anyone who threatens what I've built here, quickly and without hesitation. Marcus left without another word because there was nothing else to say. The Duke's reputation wasn't built on empty threats. He meant every word with the kind of absolute conviction that came from watching your father die, and learning that survival demanded becoming the thing other men feared. Alone again, Ceadric returned to the documents on his desk. reports from border patrols, intelligence about southern noble houses still harboring rebellious sentiment, financial records showing tax revenue increasing under his brutal efficiency. Everything ordered, everything controlled. This was his world now. Power consolidated through fear and maintained through constant vigilance against anyone who might imagine weakness. He thought about Lady Seraphina Vale sitting in her guest quarters right now, probably terrified, definitely angry, processing the reality that she'd become a political pawn in games far larger than herself. He wondered if she understood yet that her father had traded her freedom to save his own neck, that Duke Vale had handed his daughter to the North's most ruthless lord without hesitation because powerful men always sacrificed others to protect themselves. It was a lesson Ceadric had learned at 12. Now she would learn it at 23. But something nagged at him as evening darkness filled his study. The reports about her refusing marriage proposals, the reputation for being strong-willed and dangerous. Most noble daughters raised in the southern courts learned early to become decorative and obedient because that's what survival looked like for women in their world. But Seraphina apparently had chosen a different path. He found that curious despite himself. Ceadric shook the thought away with practiced discipline. She was a tool, a means of controlling her father, nothing more. He'd learned long ago not to indulge curiosity about people because curiosity led to caring, and caring led to the kind of vulnerability that got you killed. Better to remain cold, controlled, alone. Monsters survived longer that way. The next morning broke gray and bitter across Blackmere Keep. Ceadric woke before dawn, as he always did, his mind immediately shifting into the strategic calculations that governed every day. Morning reports from his steward. Training session with his personal guard. 2 hours reviewing financial records and military readiness assessments. Lunch meeting with merchants petitioning for trade route adjustments. Afternoon session dealing with petty criminal cases from nearby villages that required his judgment. The machinery of absolute rule demanded constant attention. He'd scheduled his meeting with Lady Seraphina for late afternoon, deliberately choosing the throne room rather than his private study. The setting mattered. Let her see exactly where she stood in relation to his power. Let the cold stone walls and guards stationed at every entrance remind her that Blackmere Keep operated under his control and his control alone. When the appointed hour arrived, Ceadric sat in the high-backed chair at the far end of the chamber, reviewing documents with calculated disinterest while servants brought her to him. He didn't look up immediately when the doors opened. A deliberate choice. Men who wanted others to feel small used every psychological advantage available. "My lord," Lady Seraphina Vale. The steward's announcement echoed off stone walls. Ceadric finished reading the paragraph he'd been scanning, then finally raised his eyes. She stood 30 feet away, flanked by 2 guards, and his first thought was that the reports had failed to capture something important about her. Beautiful, yes. The kind of classical beauty Southern aristocrats bred into their daughters through careful marriage politics. Dark hair pulled back severely from a face with sharp cheekbones and full lips that current court fashion would have considered too expressive. Tall for a woman, perhaps 5'8", with the kind of posture that suggested she'd been trained since childhood to enter rooms like she owned them. But it wasn't her beauty that made him pause. It was the way she looked directly at him without flinching. Most people couldn't hold his gaze for more than a few seconds. His reputation preceded him, and people saw the monster first. The man never. They looked at Duke Ceadric Raventhal and remembered stories about executions and dungeons and the absolute ruthlessness that had built his power. Their eyes would slide away almost involuntarily, an instinctive submission to a predator. Seraphina met his stare with something that looked uncomfortably close to calculation, as though she were assessing him the same way he was assessing her, measuring threat, analyzing advantage, searching for weakness. It should have annoyed him. Instead, he found it interesting. "Lady Seraphina, welcome to Blackmere Keep." He kept his tone neutral. Professional. The same voice he used for every political negotiation where emotions were liabilities and control was everything. She didn't respond immediately, just continued looking at him with those dark eyes that revealed nothing of what she was thinking. Then she inclined her head slightly, the bare minimum acknowledgement of his authority. "Duke Raventhal, thank you for your hospitality." The pause before hospitality held enough acid to strip paint. Ceadric almost smiled but caught himself. She had spirit, this one. Most political hostages arrived either terrified or already broken by the reality of their situation. But Serafina seemed angry, which was far more dangerous and considerably more interesting. He dismissed the guards with a gesture. They hesitated. Protocol dictated someone remain when the Duke met privately with women, but one look at his expression sent them retreating quickly. The doors closed with finality that echoed through the chamber. Now they were alone. Caedric stood and descended from the raised platform where his chair sat, closing the distance between them with deliberate slowness. Serafina held her ground, but he watched her shoulders tighten almost imperceptibly. Fight-or-flight reflexes activating. Good. She should be nervous. Fear kept people careful. He stopped 10 feet away, maintaining distance that felt both professional and vaguely threatening. Your quarters are satisfactory? Quite. Though I notice the windows have bars. Decorative choice or honest statement of my situation here? Her voice carried the cultured accent of Southern nobility, but with harder edges underneath. Not the soft, musical quality women were trained to cultivate. This sounded like someone who'd learned to speak without apology. Caedric tilted his head slightly. Honest statement. You're here because your father committed treason, and I'm the only reason his head remains attached to his shoulders. That makes you valuable insurance against his continued cooperation. If you prefer, I can describe you as a guest, but we both know what you actually are. A hostage. Precise language prevents misunderstanding. Something flashed across her face. Anger, definitely, but also something that looked like grudging respect for his directness. She'd probably expected him to dress up the situation in diplomatic lies. Instead, he'd offered brutal honesty because lies wasted time, and he had no patience for pretense. Serafina crossed her arms, a defensive gesture that also suggested defiance. And what exactly does being your hostage entail? Am I confined to quarters? Forbidden from certain areas? Do I require permission to breathe? The sarcasm was sharper now. Testing boundaries. Seeing how far she could push before his famous temper made an appearance, Caedric remained perfectly calm. You're confined to the keep and its immediate grounds. My guards will accompany you anywhere outside your quarters. You may move freely within those parameters. You'll attend meals in the Great Hall and participate in court functions when appropriate. I expect basic courtesy toward my staff and compliance with household security protocols. He paused, letting the weight of what came next settle between them. But understand this. Your comfort, your safety, your continued existence here depends entirely on your father's obedience. If Duke Vale honors our agreement, you'll be treated with the respect due your station. If he betrays me, you'll discover exactly how ruthless I can be when dealing with the families of traitors. Those aren't threats. They're facts. Serafina's jaw tightened, but she didn't look away. How comforting. Live as a pawn or die as punishment for my father's choices. What a generous arrangement. Your father made those choices, not me. He planned rebellion, gathered allies, smuggled weapons. He knew the consequences if discovered. I'm offering mercy he doesn't deserve because his cooperation is worth more than his execution. You should direct your anger toward the man who put you in this position, not the one who's keeping you both alive. The words came out colder than he'd intended, but that was fine. She needed to understand the reality of her situation without illusion softening the truth. Her father had been willing to sacrifice her freedom to protect himself. Caedric was simply the instrument enforcing consequences. Serafina laughed then, sharp and bitter. Mercy. You actually call this mercy, compared to what I could have done? Yes. Your father's head on a spike, your family estate seized, every southern house that conspired with him obliterated as examples. That's the alternative. Instead, he keeps his lands, his titles, his life, and his daughter survives as a guest in comfortable quarters rather than rotting in a dungeon. So yes, Lady Serafina, this is mercy. He took a step closer, close enough now that she had to tilt her head back slightly to maintain eye contact, close enough that he could see her pulse beating rapidly in her throat despite her controlled expression. You can hate me for it if that helps. Most people do. But your hatred won't change the terms of your situation here or your father's obligations to me. The only thing that matters is whether you're smart enough to survive this with your dignity intact or foolish enough to make me regret offering any mercy at all. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The throne room held nothing but the sound of wind howling through high windows and the distant crash of waves against cliffs. Serafina stared at him with an intensity that felt almost physical, and Caedric found himself studying her face more carefully than he'd intended. She was terrified. He could see it now beneath the anger and defiance. The way her hands had formed fists at her sides, the slight tremor in her jaw, the too quick breathing she was trying to control. But she was forcing herself to stand here and meet his eyes anyway, because pride or survival instinct or something else entirely refused to let her show weakness. It reminded him uncomfortably of himself at 12, locked in that tower, screaming until his voice broke while his father died below. The memory made him step back abruptly. Space, distance, control. Dinner is served in the great hall at sunset. You're expected to attend. My steward will show you the way. That's it? No more threats? No detailed list of rules designed to strip away the last shreds of my autonomy? Her voice had shifted slightly. Still angry but also confused by his sudden retreat, Kedrick turned toward the doors, done with this conversation and the uncomfortable feelings it was stirring up. No, you've heard the rules, break them and face consequences. Simple. He was halfway across the throne room when her voice stopped him. Do you enjoy this? Holding people's lives over them? Using fear as currency? He paused but didn't turn around. The question revealed more about her than she probably realized. She wasn't asking about cruelty for its own sake. She was trying to understand whether he was a monster by nature or necessity. The honest answer would have surprised her. I enjoy survival, Lady Seraphina. Everything else is just methodology. Then he left her standing alone in that vast stone chamber while winds shrieked through the castle like ghosts of every person who'd learned too late that Duke Cadric Raventhal meant every word he spoke and spared no mercy for those who tested him. The great hall at Blackmere Keep could seat 200 people during formal occasions, but tonight held only about 40. Kedric's inner court, military commanders, advisors, trusted merchants with enough wealth and influence to warrant inclusion in the Duke's elite circle. They occupied the long tables arranged hierarchically according to status and usefulness, everyone positioned precisely where they belonged in the fortress's brutal power structure. Seraphina entered just as the first courses were being served, accompanied by 2 guards who peeled away once she stepped through the massive doors. Every conversation died immediately. 40 pairs of eyes turned toward her with varying degrees of curiosity, calculation, and barely concealed hostility. She wore crimson, not the mourning black appropriate for a widow, not the subdued colors expected of someone in her precarious position. Deep, blood-red silk that caught torchlight and made her look like something dangerous entering a room full of predators. Kedric, seated at the head table on a raised dais that overlooked the hall, felt something shift in his chest. Anger, maybe. Or possibly admiration. She was making a statement, refusing to perform submission even when surrounded by people who could destroy her on his order. Reckless, brave, foolish. Marcus appeared beside her immediately, murmuring directions. But Seraphina had already located the empty seat at the high table, 20 feet from where the Duke sat. 20 feet. Close enough to be clearly marked as his hostage, far enough to preserve some illusion of independence. She crossed the hall with her head high while conversations resumed slowly, everyone pretending not to stare, while absolutely staring. Guards watched with hands resting on sword hilts. Noble women whispered behind raised hands. The military commanders studied her with the cold assessment of men evaluating potential threats. Seraphina reached her seat and stood there deliberately, waiting, not sitting immediately like a servant, waiting for acknowledgement from the Duke like an equal. The hall went quiet again. This was a test. Everyone understood it. Would Kedric enforce proper deference or allow this breach of protocol to stand? He held her gaze for 3 long seconds, aware that his response would be analyzed and discussed for weeks. Then he gave the smallest nod. Permission granted. She sat with fluid grace that suggested years of training in aristocratic deportment. Kedric turned his attention back to his meal and conversations resumed, but tension remained threaded through the air like invisible wire. Lord Theron, his military commander, leaned closer from the adjacent seat. Bold choice of wardrobe for a hostage. The man's tone was neutral, but his meaning clear. Seraphina was making herself a problem, and problems in Blackmere Keep typically got solved with brutal efficiency. She's making a point, which is that she refuses to be invisible, that taking her freedom doesn't mean taking her dignity. Kedric spoke quietly, but several nearby courtiers heard anyway. Let them. Let everyone understand he wouldn't tolerate disrespect toward her, even if her status was complicated. She was under his protection, however conditional, and that meant something in the North's harsh hierarchy. Theron grunted. Respectfully, my lord, showing that kind of tolerance might be interpreted as weakness. If she's truly a hostage, perhaps she should be reminded of it more firmly. And if I wanted your opinion on how to handle political prisoners, I would have asked for it. The commander went quiet immediately, hearing the ice beneath those words. Kadric didn't need to raise his voice to make men understand when they'd overstepped. The temperature in conversations told them everything. He glanced down the table to where Seraphina sat, apparently focused on her meal, but clearly aware of every eye on her. A servant offered wine and she accepted with a polite nod. Another set down the first course and she thanked them quietly. Perfect manners. Perfect composure. But her jaw was tight and her shoulders carried tension that suggested she was holding herself together through sheer force of will. Kadric understood that better than he wanted to admit. Dinner proceeded through multiple courses while conversation ebbed and flowed around the hall. Court politics, military assessments, reports about merchant activity and tax revenue. The mundane machinery of rule that required constant attention. Kedrick participated with half his focus, while the other half kept returning to the woman in crimson who'd walked into his fortress like she owned it despite being a prisoner in everything but name. Halfway through the meal, Lord Gregor, an older nobleman who'd served Kedrick's father, raised his wine cup and called for attention. The hall quieted immediately. "A toast, my lord, to Duke Kadric Raventhal, who rules the north with the strength our enemies fear and the wisdom our people need." Standard flattery, calculated to curry favor while reinforcing the duke's authority before the entire court. Kadric inclined his head in acknowledgement while everyone raised their cups, except Seraphina. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, wine untouched, making no move to participate in the toast. The slight was deliberate and unmistakable, refusing to honor him publicly while surrounded by his most loyal followers. The hall froze again. This was beyond boldness. This was open defiance. Lord Gregor's face flushed red. "Lady Seraphina, perhaps you didn't hear clearly. We're toasting the Duke who generously permits you to breathe his air and eat his food." The older man's voice carried warning wrapped in formal courtesy. Last chance to correct the mistake before consequences arrived. Seraphina looked at him calmly. "I heard perfectly, Lord Gregor. I simply declined to toast a man who holds me hostage against my will. Forgive me if my enthusiasm for celebrating my captor's wisdom is somewhat limited." Silence crashed over the great hall like a physical force. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Every person present understood that this moment would define everything that happened next. The Duke's authority had been challenged publicly by his hostage, and how he responded would either reinforce his reputation for absolute control or reveal cracks that his enemies would immediately exploit. Kedrick set down his wine cup with deliberate precision. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the sudden quiet. He should destroy her for this. Immediate and brutal consequences for public defiance. That's what the Duke of Blackmere would do. That's what everyone expected. Fear required constant reinforcement, and mercy looked like weakness to men always searching for vulnerabilities to exploit. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way she held herself, terrified but refusing to bend. Maybe it was how her defiance reminded him of his father, who'd also refused to submit to corrupt authority, even when submission might have saved him. Or maybe it was the uncomfortable recognition that Seraphina's hatred was honest in a court full of sycophants who smiled while plotting his destruction. He stood slowly. The movement made several people flinch. Lady Seraphina makes an excellent point. The words landed like stones thrown into still water. Ripples of confusion spread through the assembled court. This was not the response anyone had anticipated. Kedrick walked along the high table, closing the distance to where she sat. She didn't look away even as he stopped directly beside her chair, close enough to be deliberately intimidating. "You object to toasting your captor's wisdom." "Reasonable. I object to many things about the circumstances that brought you here. Your father's treason, the necessity of taking you hostage, the political realities that make such arrangements necessary in the first place." He paused, letting everyone hear what came next. But wisdom doesn't require universal approval. It requires effective outcomes. Your father is cooperating. His southern allies are being systematically eliminated. The rebellion that threatened to destabilize the entire kingdom has been prevented. Those are facts regardless of whether you find them palatable. Kaedric picked up her wine cup and held it out to her. "So let's modify the toast. Not to my wisdom, which you're free to doubt. To survival, yours and your father's, and everyone in this hall who understands that living to fight another day is smarter than dying for pride." Serafina stared at the cup like it might be poisoned. The entire hall watched to see what she'd do next. Accept and acknowledge his authority, however grudgingly. Refuse again and discover exactly how far his tolerance extended. She took the wine. Her hand didn't shake. Then she stood, meeting his eyes from inches away, and raised the cup. To survival, then. However empty and bitter it tastes. The words were aimed like knives, but she drank anyway. A compromise that preserved her dignity while acknowledging reality. Kadric smiled without warmth. "Good. We understand each other." He returned to his seat while the hall erupted in quiet conversations, everyone processing what had just happened. The Duke had been defied publicly and responded with understanding, negotiation. It didn't fit his reputation for absolute ruthlessness. People would talk about this for weeks, analyzing every word and gesture for deeper meaning. Let them talk. Kadric knew something they didn't. Serafina Vale was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with physical threat. She was intelligent enough to understand power dynamics, brave enough to challenge them despite consequences, and honest enough to say what everyone else thought, but never dared speak aloud. That combination could destroy him more effectively than any rebellion if he wasn't careful. But careful was what he did best. The meal continued without further incident. Dessert courses appeared and disappeared. Wine flowed freely while conversations grew louder and less guarded. Eventually, people began excusing themselves, the evening winding down as courtiers returned to their quarters and guards changed shifts. Kedrick remained at the high table longer than necessary, reviewing reports that Marcus brought him between courses. Always working, always calculating. The machinery of power required constant attention, or it started breaking down in ways that got people killed. He was signing execution orders for 3 convicted smugglers when he noticed Serafina still sitting 20 feet away, her meal barely touched, staring at nothing in particular. Everyone else had left. The great hall stood empty except for servants clearing tables and guards stationed at the doors. She should have retreated to her quarters an hour ago. Instead, she sat alone in that crimson dress like a blood stain against the dark stone walls. Kadric stood and walked over slowly. She didn't acknowledge his approach even when he stopped beside her chair. The food here doesn't meet Southern standards? Serafina blinked, pulled from whatever thoughts had been consuming her. She looked up at him with exhaustion, finally showing through the defiant mask she'd maintained all evening. "The food is fine. I'm just not particularly hungry." "Understandable. Stress tends to affect appetite. Is that what we're calling this? Stress?" Her voice carried bone-deep weariness now that they were alone. All the fight had drained out, leaving only tired resignation. Kaedric pulled out the chair across from her and sat without asking permission. Up close, he could see dark circles under her eyes that cosmetics hadn't quite hidden. The slight tremor in her hands that she was trying to control. The way her breath came just a little too fast. She was falling apart. Had probably been falling apart since the moment guards escorted her from her father's estate and brought her north to a fortress ruled by the kingdom's most feared man. The Defiance had been armor protecting her from complete breakdown. "When did you last sleep?" Serafina laughed without humor. "What day is it?" "Wednesday. Then 3 days ago, possibly 4. Time gets strange when your entire life collapses." She said it casually, but Kaedric heard the fracture beneath the words. This wasn't just anger about being taken hostage. This was accumulated trauma finally breaking through. "Your father told you the truth about his rebellion?" "Eventually. After your guards arrived at our estate with enough evidence to see our entire family executed. He explained very carefully how he'd made a deal with the terrifying Duke of Blackmere, that I was the price of his survival. And?" Serafina met his eyes, and hers held something worse than hatred. They held complete emptiness. And I stopped being surprised by how willing powerful men are to sacrifice everyone around them to protect themselves. The words hit harder than she probably intended because Kaedric recognized the sentiment intimately. He'd learned that lesson at 12, watching his father die while the crown celebrated and his mother retreated into grief so complete she'd never truly emerged from it. Power required ruthlessness. Survival required sacrifice. These were fundamental truths about the world. But that didn't make them hurt less when you were the one being sacrificed. He should leave, return to his study and the endless documents requiring attention. Serafina wasn't his responsibility beyond keeping her alive and useful as leverage. Her emotional state was irrelevant to the strategic calculations that governed his decisions. Instead, he heard himself say something unexpected. Your husband, the hunting accident. Was it actually an accident? Serafina's head snapped up, and for the first time all evening, genuine emotion cracked through her exhaustion. Surprise. Suspicion. Something that might have been pain. Why would you ask that? Because men don't typically die in hunting accidents unless someone wants them dead, and you're smart enough to have considered the possibility. Silence stretched between them, while servants cleared the last tables and pretended not to listen. Serafina studied his face like she was trying to determine whether this was some kind of trap or actual curiosity. Finally, she answered, I don't know. Maybe. Probably. He had gambling debts to dangerous people and political enemies my father made through his scheming. The official investigation called it an accident, but the details never quite made sense. Her voice had gone flat, reciting facts that she'd probably turned over in her mind 1,000 times, searching for truth that kept slipping away. So, you've spent 2 years wondering if your husband was murdered and being unable to prove it or punish anyone responsible if he was. Yes. And then your father commits treason, hands you to me as insurance, and you end up trapped in Blackmere Keep with nothing except questions and grief and the terrifying uncertainty of not knowing what happens next. Serafina's jaw tightened. You're very perceptive for a monster. I'm perceptive because I am a monster. Understanding how trauma shapes people is useful when your entire life is built on exploiting their weaknesses. He said it without apology because pretending otherwise was pointless. They both knew exactly what he was. The kingdom's most ruthless lord who'd clawed his way to power through violence and calculation, an absolute refusal to show mercy that might be mistaken for weakness. But sitting across from this exhausted woman who'd lost her husband maybe to murder and definitely lost her freedom to her father's cowardice, Kaedric felt something uncomfortably close to recognition. They were both survivors of powerful men's machinations, both trapped in situations not of their making, both forced to become harder and colder than they'd ever wanted just to keep breathing. The difference was, he'd had 15 years to perfect his armor while hers was still being forged in real time. You should sleep, he said quietly. Tomorrow will be difficult enough without adding exhaustion to everything else. Difficult how? Court functions. Public appearances. My enemies will be watching to see how you behave and what weaknesses they can exploit through you. It's going to be exhausting and uncomfortable, and you'll have to perform strength you probably don't feel. Serafina laughed bitterly. So nothing different from every other day of my life as a noblewoman? No, probably not. He stood and gestured toward the doors where her guard escort waited. She rose as well, swaying slightly before catching herself. Definitely past the point of exhaustion. They walked in silence through corridors lit by torches that cast dancing shadows on stone walls. Their footsteps echoed in the emptiness. Blackmere Keep at night felt like a tomb, all cold stone and darkness pressing in from every direction. At the entrance to the east wing where her quarters waited, Serafina paused and turned to face him. For a moment, she looked like she wanted to say something, then thought better of it. But Kaedric waited, and eventually she spoke. Why did you let me defy you tonight? Everyone expected you to punish me. Instead, you changed the toast and made it seem almost reasonable, because punishment would have been easy and obvious. Breaking your spirit publicly would have reinforced my reputation, but taught you nothing except to fear me more. I don't need your fear, Lady Serafina. I need your father's obedience, which your presence here already guarantees. He paused, then added something he hadn't planned to say. And because your defiance was honest, half the people in that hall would smile at me while planning my assassination if they thought they could succeed. You at least have the courage to hate me openly. That's worth something in a court built on lies. Serafina stared at him like she was seeing him for the first time, trying to reconcile the monster of reputation with the man who'd just admitted to valuing honesty over fear. I don't understand you. Good. Keep it that way. Understanding leads to sympathy, and sympathy makes you vulnerable. Better to think of me as the ruthless captor and yourself as the unwilling hostage. Clean categories, simple dynamics. But you're not simple. No, he agreed. But I'm definitely ruthless. Don't mistake complexity for kindness, Lady Serafina. I'm capable of terrible things when necessary. The fact that I choose not to destroy you doesn't mean I couldn't or wouldn't if circumstances changed. The warning was clear and genuine. He needed her to understand that whatever strange moment this was, It didn't change the fundamental power imbalance between them or the consequences that would follow if her father proved disloyal. Serafina nodded slowly, noted, "The monster has layers but still has teeth." Exactly. She turned toward her quarters, then glanced back one final time. "For what it's worth, Duke Raventhal, I don't think you're the monster everyone says you are. I think you're something more complicated and probably more dangerous because of it." Then she disappeared through the doorway before he could respond, leaving Kaedric standing alone in the corridor with an uncomfortable feeling settling in his chest. He'd dealt with hostages before, political prisoners who hated him or feared him, or both. It was simple, transactional. They existed as leverage, and he treated them with the cold efficiency such arrangements required. But Serafina was different somehow. She refused to perform the role he'd assigned her, kept challenging expectations, made him explain himself when he never explained himself to anyone. And worst of all, she'd looked at him tonight and seen past the reputation to something underneath. That was dangerous, because if she could see past his carefully constructed armor, she might eventually find the broken 12-year-old boy still screaming inside the man who'd learned to survive by becoming the thing everyone feared. And that boy couldn't protect anyone, not even himself. Kaedric returned to his study and threw himself into work, losing hours in documents and strategic planning until exhaustion finally dragged him towards sleep. But before unconsciousness claimed him completely, one thought flickered through his mind unbidden. When Serafina had raised that wine cup and toasted survival, despite everything, she'd looked at him with something that wasn't quite hatred anymore. And that terrified him more than any rebellion ever could, because Duke Kaedric Raventhal had built his entire existence on being feared. He had no idea what to do with someone who refused to be afraid. 3 weeks passed like a slow-burning fuse. Serafina attended court functions and public dinners where she maintained her impossible balance between compliance and defiance. She obeyed the rules governing her confinement, but found small ways to assert independence that drove the Duke's advisors quietly insane. Wearing colors that made statements, asking pointed questions during council sessions when women were expected to remain decorative and silent, walking through Blackmere's corridors like she belonged there instead of cowering in her quarters like a proper hostage. And Kaedric found himself watching her with increasing frequency despite knowing it was a mistake. He told himself it was strategic observation. Understanding his leverage meant understanding the person providing it. But that explanation grew thinner every time he caught himself studying the way lamplight caught in her dark hair, or noticing how her rare smiles transformed her entire face, or feeling something uncomfortably warm settle in his chest when she laughed at something Marcus said during dinner. His court noticed. Of course they noticed. Nothing happened in Blackmere Keep without becoming immediate currency in the gossip economy that fueled noble politics. Lord Theron mentioned it first during a private military briefing, his tone carefully neutral. "The Lady Serafina seems to be adjusting to life in the fortress, my lord. She's resilient. I expected as much based on her reputation." The men are talking, wondering if the Duke's attention toward his hostage represents strategic interest or something more complicated. Kaedric's hand stilled over the map they'd been studying. His voice went cold enough to freeze blood. "Tell the men that speculation about my private interests is an excellent way to find themselves reassigned to the farthest border outposts where they can freeze to death while contemplating the virtues of discretion." Theron wisely dropped the subject. But the warning didn't stop the whispers because whispers fed on prohibition like fire fed on dry wood. Within days, half the court was discussing whether Duke Kaedric had developed inappropriate interest in his political prisoner. The other half was already planning how to exploit any perceived weakness. It came to a head during the weekly council session where Kaedric's inner circle gathered to discuss territory management and strategic planning. Serafina attended these sessions at his request. A calculated decision to demonstrate that she remained valuable and alive, proof transmitted through merchant gossip back to her father that his daughter's well-being continued as promised. She typically sat in the back, silent and observant, learning the machinery of northern politics. But today, Lord Peter, a minor nobleman with more ambition than sense, made a mistake. They were discussing tax increases to fund military expansion when Peter stood and addressed the Duke directly. "My lord, if I may raise a sensitive matter, there are concerns among certain houses about the Lady Serafina's influence over recent policy decisions." The council chamber went quiet immediately. Everyone understood this was a direct challenge dressed in diplomatic language. Cadric set down his pen with deliberate precision. Explain. Peter shifted uncomfortably but pressed forward, probably emboldened by others who'd put him up to this. Your decision to reduce tariffs on southern trade routes last week. Your increased lenience toward nobles from houses that supported Duke Vale's rebellion. Some believe these choices reflect external influence rather than strategic judgment. The implication was unmistakable, that the Duke was being manipulated by his beautiful hostage, that his famous ruthlessness had been compromised by something as pathetic as attraction, that Duke Cadric Raventhal, the North's most feared lord, had become vulnerable in the oldest and most humiliating way possible. The chamber held collective breath while everyone waited to see how the Duke responded to this barely veiled accusation. Cadric stood slowly. The movement was almost casual, but every person present recognized it as the predator rising before striking. Lord Peter, let me make certain I understand your concern. You believe recent policy decisions represent compromised judgment because a woman I'm holding hostage might somehow be influencing me? I'm simply raising questions others are asking, my lord. Interesting. Because those policy decisions have resulted in increased trade revenue, intelligence gathering from previously hostile southern houses, and diplomatic advantages with merchant guilds who now view the North as reasonable rather than tyrannical. But you see manipulation where I see effective strategy. He walked around the council table slowly, closing distance while Peter's face went progressively paler. Tell me something, Lord Peter. When you question my judgment publicly, are you concerned about policy outcomes? Or are you and your allies searching for weakness to exploit? Because one suggests legitimate governance, the other suggests treason. The last word landed like an executioner's blade. Peter stumbled backward, hands raised defensively. My lord, I meant no disrespect. You were simply testing whether you could undermine my authority by implying I've been compromised by a woman, that my control has slipped, that the Duke of Blackmere has become soft and vulnerable. Cadric stopped directly in front of Peter, close enough that the nobleman had to crane his neck to maintain eye contact. So let me clarify something for everyone present. Lady Seraphina Vale is a political hostage guaranteeing her father's cooperation. Nothing more. My policies are determined by strategic calculation, not external influence, and anyone who continues spreading rumors suggesting otherwise will find themselves explaining their concerns from a dungeon cell while I investigate exactly who put them up to this. He turned his gaze across the assembled council, making sure everyone felt the weight of his displeasure. Are we clear? A chorus of affirmations followed immediately. Lord Peter looked ready to vomit. Cadric dismissed him with a gesture, and the nobleman fled the chamber so quickly he nearly tripped over furniture in his haste to escape. After he'd gone, the Duke addressed the council once more. I'll say this once. The Lady Seraphina exists here as leverage. When she ceases to be useful in that capacity, she'll be released or disposed of according to strategic necessity. Until then, she remains my concern and my decision. Anyone else with questions about my judgment should direct them to me privately rather than performing palace intrigue like incompetent conspirators. The session continued, but tension remained thick enough to choke on. Cadric forced himself not to look toward the back of the chamber where Seraphina sat. Didn't want to know whether she'd been hurt by his brutal reduction of her existence to strategic value. Couldn't afford to care even if she had been. Because Lord Peter was right about one thing. The Duke's attention toward his hostage had become noticeable, and noticeable meant vulnerable. And vulnerable got you killed in environments built on exploiting weakness. So he'd done what survival demanded, publicly reinforced that she meant nothing beyond political utility, reminded everyone, including himself, that caring was a liability he couldn't afford, even if that reminder felt like ripping something vital out of his own chest. The council session ended an hour later. Lords filed out quickly, no one wanting to linger in the Duke's cold displeasure. Marcus gathered documents. Guards changed positions at the doors. Cadric remained seated at the head of the table, staring at nothing in particular while something uncomfortable settled in his stomach like swallowed glass. He'd been protecting himself, making sure no one could use Seraphina as a weapon against him. It was necessary, strategic. Then why did he feel like he'd just committed a betrayal? My lord? The voice came from behind him, soft but steady. He didn't need to turn around to know Seraphina stood there, having waited until everyone else left. You should return to your quarters. I wanted to thank you. Cadric did turn then, surprised despite himself. She stood 10 feet away, hands clasped in front of her, expression unreadable. Thank me for defending yourself, for reminding me and everyone else exactly what I am here. It's easy to forget sometimes that I'm just a political tool, useful to have that clarified. Her tone was perfectly neutral, but he heard the hurt beneath it, saw it in the way her shoulders had tensed and her jaw was set too tight. Serafina, no, really, you were right. I am leverage, insurance, a means to an end. Reducing me to that in front of your counsel was smart politics, strategic, everything you are. She took a step forward and her eyes held something fierce now, something that looked like anger cutting through the hurt. But I wonder sometimes if you've spent so long being strategic that you've forgotten how to be honest, even with yourself. Careful, Lady Serafina, you're dangerously close to overstepping. Am I? Or am I just saying what nobody else will? That the fearsome Duke of Blackmere spends his days calculating every interaction like a chess game, because actually, feeling something might reveal that he's not the invincible monster everyone thinks he is. The words struck harder than she probably intended because they were uncomfortably accurate. Kadric stood slowly, using his physical presence the way he always did when conversations threatened to go places he couldn't afford to follow. You're right. I calculate. I strategize. I treat people as assets or liabilities because that's what keeps me alive and powerful in a world that would destroy me the moment I showed weakness. Your hurt feelings don't change that reality. No, they don't. But they might change how I see you. She moved closer now, close enough that he could see the pulse beating in her throat, close enough that something electric hummed between them in the empty council chamber. For weeks, I've watched you rule this fortress with absolute control, seen you crush opposition without hesitation. Witness the fear you inspire in men who'd probably sell their souls for a fraction of your power. And I thought I understood you, the ruthless Duke, the monster of reputation. Her voice dropped lower, more intense. But then I see moments where that mask slips. When you changed the toast so I could participate without complete humiliation. When you asked about my husband knowing it would hurt. When you sit in your study until dawn because controlling everything means never resting. And I realize you're not just a monster, Kadric. You're a man so terrified of being vulnerable that you've turned yourself into something incapable of connection. The use of his given name felt shockingly intimate. No one called him Kadric anymore except Marcus, occasionally in private. Titles created distance. Distance meant safety. But hearing it from her in that quiet chamber with afternoon light filtering through high windows made something crack inside his carefully maintained armor. You don't know what you're talking about, don't I? Then tell me I'm wrong. Tell me you don't lie awake wondering what it would feel like to stop calculating and just exist. Tell me you're completely satisfied being feared instead of known. Kadric wanted to walk away. Should have walked away. But his feet refused to move and her dark eyes held him trapped more effectively than any dungeon. What I want doesn't matter. Only survival matters. That's the saddest thing I've ever heard. Reality isn't sad. It just is. I learned that when I was 12 years old watching my father die because he was too good and too trusting in a world that eats good men alive. You want me to be something softer, something capable of connection? That man would have been destroyed years ago, maybe. Or maybe you've spent so long convinced that vulnerability equals death that you can't see the difference between strategic caution and emotional cowardice. The accusation landed like a physical blow. Kadric's hands formed fists at his sides and cold rage flooded through him, the kind that preceded violence in men who'd learned to weaponize anger. You're crossing lines you don't understand. Good. Someone needs to. Because watching you slowly suffocate under the weight of your own isolation is almost as tragic as watching my father trade my freedom to save his neck. Her voice had risen now, anger bleeding through hurt, and suddenly they were both breathing hard in the charged atmosphere of the council chamber. I hate that you took me hostage. I hate that my father's cowardice put me here. I hate this fortress, and the cold, and the constant fear of saying something that gets me thrown in a dungeon. Serafina's eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. But what I hate most is that somewhere underneath all your calculation and control, there's a decent man so terrified of his own humanity that he'd rather be a monster everyone fears than risk caring about anything except power. She turned toward the doors, done with this confrontation, but Kadric's voice stopped her. Serafina. She paused, but didn't turn around. You think you see something in me worth caring about? Some hidden humanity that just needs the right person to reach it? That's a fantasy. A story you're telling yourself to make your situation more bearable. But I am exactly what I appear to be. Ruthless, cold, incapable of the kind of connection you're imagining. Now she did turn, and her expression held something that looked like pity. Keep telling yourself that, Duke Raventhal. Maybe eventually it'll become true enough that you can finally stop lying awake at night wondering who you'd be if you'd made different choices 15 years ago. Then she left him standing alone in that vast stone chamber while her words echoed in the sudden emptiness. Kadric didn't move for a long time. Eventually, as sunset painted the high windows crimson, he returned to his study and threw himself into work with desperate intensity. Reports, correspondence, military assessments, anything to fill his mind with the familiar machinery of control and strategy. But Seraphina's accusation kept returning. Emotional cowardice. The words circled his thoughts like vultures waiting for something to die. Because she was right. He knew she was right. Every instinct screamed that letting anyone close meant giving them the power to destroy him. That vulnerability was just another word for weakness waiting to be exploited. That caring about anything except power and survival was the kind of mistake that got you killed or broken or both. But somewhere underneath all those carefully constructed justifications, a 12-year-old boy was still screaming in a locked tower, watching his father die and learning that the world was cruel and love was a luxury that got people murdered. And maybe, just maybe, that boy had been surviving for so long that he'd forgotten how to live. Dawn found Kadric still awake at his desk, staring at documents he couldn't focus on, while his mind turned over problems that had nothing to do with strategy or politics. He'd built everything around control, made himself into something feared and powerful because fear was armor and power was survival. It had worked perfectly for 15 years, until a woman in a crimson dress walked into his fortress and refused to pretend he was just a monster, until someone finally looked past his reputation and saw the man underneath. And now Duke Kadric Raventhal, the North's most ruthless lord, faced the most terrifying question of his entire life. What happened if he stopped hiding? The answer crashed through his thoughts with devastating clarity. He'd either discover he was still human underneath all the armor, or learn that the monster was all that remained. The Northern Territories woke to rumors that traveled faster than sunlight across frozen ground. Duke Kadric Raventhal had spent an entire night alone in his study after a confrontation with his hostage that left servants whispering and guards exchanging nervous glances. Something had shifted in Blackmere Keep's carefully maintained order. The air itself felt different, charged with tension that had nothing to do with politics or military strategy and everything to do with the dangerous space between two people who'd stopped pretending they were anything other than what circumstances had forced them to become. Kadric stood at his window watching dawn break over the cliffs, still wearing yesterday's clothes, eyes burning from lack of sleep. His reflection in the glass looked gaunt, haunted, like something essential had been carved out during the night, and he hadn't figured out yet whether to feel relieved or terrified by its absence. Emotional cowardice. Seraphina's accusation kept circling his thoughts like a blade looking for somewhere to cut, because she'd seen through every defense he'd spent 15 years constructing, stripped away the reputation and the fear and the brutal efficiency to expose the fundamental truth underneath. He was afraid. Not of enemies or rebellions or assassination attempts. Those were manageable threats, calculable risks. He'd built an entire existence around navigating danger with cold precision. No, what terrified Duke Kadric Raventhal was the possibility that if he stopped performing control for even a moment, he'd discover there was nothing left inside except the screaming 12-year-old who'd watched his father die and learned that caring about anything made you vulnerable to unimaginable pain. Better to be empty than broken. Better to be feared than destroyed. Except Seraphina had walked into his fortress and somehow made emptiness feel worse than vulnerability. Made isolation seem less like protection and more like slow suffocation. And now he stood here at dawn wondering what the hell he was supposed to do with feelings he'd spent half his life teaching himself not to have. The knock came precisely at 6, Marcus with morning reports, and the day's schedule arranged with the military precision Kadric demanded from everyone including himself. Enter. His steward appeared carrying documents and wearing the carefully neutral expression of a man who'd learned not to comment on his employer's obvious exhaustion. "Good morning, my lord. The council requested your review of the trade agreements before this afternoon's session. Lord Theron needs approval for the winter military rotations. And Lady Seraphina sent a message requesting to speak with you at your earliest convenience." Kadric's hand stilled over the papers Marcus was arranging on his desk. About what? She didn't specify, simply said it was important and requested a private audience. His first instinct was to refuse. Distance. Control. Don't let her close enough to make things more complicated than they already were. But refusing would be obvious avoidance, and avoidance was its own kind of weakness. This afternoon, after the council session, my study, not the throne room, Marcus nodded and left with the efficient silence that made him invaluable in a court where discretion was currency. Alone again, Kedrick forced himself through the morning routine. Cold water splashed on his face. Fresh clothes that erased physical evidence of sleeplessness, even if they couldn't hide what exhaustion did to his eyes. Documents reviewed and annotated with the focused intensity that kept his mind from wandering toward dangerous territory. Work was safe. Strategy was familiar. If he could just maintain control over the next few hours, maybe the uncomfortable feelings from last night would fade back into the manageable numbness he'd perfected over 15 years. Maybe he could go back to being the monster everyone expected. The council session started badly and deteriorated from there. Lord Peter hadn't appeared, which was expected after yesterday's humiliation. But his absence created a vacuum that other ambitious nobles immediately tried to fill with barely concealed maneuvering. Trade disputes that were actually territorial challenges. Military concerns that masked power plays. Everyone testing boundaries now that the Duke had shown something that might have been weakness when he defended his judgment regarding his hostage. Kedrick crushed each challenge with surgical efficiency. His voice never rose. His expression never changed. But the temperature in the chamber dropped with every word, until men were shifting uncomfortably and avoiding eye contact because they'd remembered too late exactly who they were dealing with. This was the Duke of Blackmere, the man who'd built absolute authority from his father's assassination and maintained it through ruthless calculation. Yesterday's confrontation with Serafina hadn't changed that. Nothing had changed that. He was still the most dangerous man in the north. The session ended with everyone thoroughly reminded of their place in the hierarchy. Lords filed out quickly, conversations dying the moment they passed the Duke's cold gaze. Marcus gathered documents. Guards resumed their positions. And Kedrick sat in his chair feeling hollower than he had in years, despite successfully reasserting control. Because he'd just spent 2 hours performing the role Serafina had accused him of hiding behind. The ruthless lord, the calculating politician, the monster who reduced everything to strategy and never let humanity complicate his decisions. She'd been right about that too. He returned to his study and poured whiskey he didn't particularly want but drank anyway because it gave. His hands something to do while he waited for the afternoon audience he was already regretting agreeing to. The knock came exactly on time. Serafina didn't make people wait or arrive late to prove points. She understood power dynamics too well for amateur manipulation. Come in. She entered wearing dark blue today instead of her usual crimson. The color made her look softer somehow, less like a deliberate provocation and more like someone genuinely exhausted by constant performance. Her hair was pulled back severely, but a few strands had escaped to frame her face in ways that suggested she either hadn't noticed or didn't care about perfect presentation. Kedrick gestured toward the chairs near the fireplace, deliberately choosing the informal seating area instead of staying behind his desk. Small concession. Acknowledgement that this wasn't an official audience between captor and hostage, though he wasn't entirely sure what it was instead. They sat in silence for a moment. Fire crackling, wind howling outside, the weight of yesterday's confrontation hanging between them like smoke that refused to dissipate. Finally, Serafina spoke. I came to apologize. Kedrick had been expecting accusations or demands, or possibly another challenge to his emotional honesty. An apology knocked him so off balance that his carefully maintained neutrality slipped for a second. For what? For overstepping yesterday. For saying things that weren't my place to say. You're right that I don't understand the full complexity of your position here. The threats you face. The calculations required to survive in your world. She looked at him directly and her eyes held something tired but honest. I've spent 2 years angry at my father for his cowardice. Angry at the circumstances that made me a widow and then a hostage. Angry at powerful men who treat people like chess pieces. And I took that anger out on you by pretending I understood your choices when I don't. Can't, really, because I've never had to build what you've built, or protect what you're protecting. Kedrick studied her carefully, searching for manipulation beneath the apparent sincerity, but Serafina had never been good at hiding what she felt. It was one of the first things he'd noticed about her. honesty that bordered on reckless in environments where deception was survival. You meant what you said about emotional cowardice. Yes, but meaning it doesn't make it fair. Your trauma isn't mine to weaponize just because I'm frustrated with my situation. She leaned forward slightly and her voice dropped lower. I spent all night thinking about what you said, about your father, about being 12 and watching him die. And I realized I've been so focused on my own loss that I didn't consider what it costs you to function the way you do, to rule the way you rule. You're not a monster choosing cruelty. You're a survivor doing whatever it takes to never be that helpless again. The words landed with unexpected force because no one had ever articulated it quite that way before. Everyone saw the Duke's ruthlessness as character trait or moral failing. None of them understood it was scar tissue grown over wounds that had never properly healed. Kedrick's throat tightened dangerously. He took a long drink of whiskey to buy time while his composure reassembled itself. That doesn't excuse how I've treated you. Using you as leverage against your father. Keeping you here against your will. Reducing your existence to strategic value whenever it suits my purposes. No, it doesn't excuse it. But it explains it. And I think explanation matters when trying to understand someone instead of just hating them. Serafina's expression shifted into something complicated. Part resignation, part curiosity, part something else he couldn't quite identify. I don't want to hate you, Kedrick. I probably should. Everything about this situation says I should despise you completely. But I can't seem to manage it no matter how hard I try. Why not? Because every time I convince myself you're just the monster everyone says, you do something that reminds me there's a person underneath. You changed that toast so I could participate without humiliation. You asked about my husband knowing it would hurt, but also knowing I needed someone to acknowledge that my grief was real. You sit in council sessions and make impossible decisions that keep this entire territory functioning, even though it means never resting and always being the villain. Her voice caught slightly. And because when you look at me sometimes, I see the same exhaustion I feel. The same desperate need to stop performing survival long enough to figure out if there's anything left inside except fear and anger and the weight of other people's expectations. The admission hung in the air between them like something fragile and dangerous. Kedrick knew he should shut this down immediately, reassert distance, remind both of them that she was a hostage and he was her captor, and anything else was fantasy that would get them both destroyed. But the words wouldn't come, because Serafina had just described exactly what he felt every morning when he woke up, and every night when exhaustion finally dragged him toward sleep. The suffocating awareness that he'd spent so long being what circumstances demanded that he'd lost track of who he actually was underneath the armor. I don't know how to be anything except what I am. The confession emerged quieter than he'd intended, more vulnerable. He immediately regretted it, but Serafina's expression shifted into something that looked almost like relief. I know. That's what makes this so complicated. She stood and moved to the window, staring out at the frozen landscape with her arms wrapped around herself like she was cold despite the fire's warmth. I've been thinking about what you said, about survival being the only thing that matters. And I understand why you believe that, why you've structured your entire existence around staying alive and powerful, no matter the cost. But she turned to face him, and her eyes held challenge again, but gentler than before. But there's a difference between surviving and living. And I think you've spent so long focused on the first that you've forgotten the second is even possible. Kedrick stood as well, suddenly needing movement to contain the uncomfortable energy building in his chest. Living is a luxury for people who don't have kingdoms depending on them, and enemies waiting for any sign of weakness. Or maybe it's a necessity that you've convinced yourself is weakness, because actually wanting something beyond power would mean admitting there's more to lose than just survival. You're doing it again. Analyzing me like you understand what drives my decisions. Then explain it to me. Make me understand why the Duke of Blackmere sits alone in his study every night pushing everyone away while simultaneously being terrified of ending up completely isolated. Because isolation is safer. The words came out harsh, defensive. But Serafina didn't flinch. Safer than what? Than letting someone see you're human? Than risking connection that might actually mean something? Than caring about someone and watching them get destroyed because I cared? The admission ripped out of him before he could stop it, raw and unfiltered. The fundamental truth he'd been avoiding for 15 years, finally spoken aloud in his private study, while a woman who should have been nothing more than political leverage looked at him like she could see straight through to his foundation. Serafina's expression cracked into something that looked like understanding mixed with pain. Your father. Kaedric turned away because he couldn't look at her and say this. Couldn't watch her face while he finally articulated the lesson that had shaped everything he'd become. I loved my father, looked up to him, believed in everything he stood for. Honor, justice, protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. He was everything a duke should be, and I wanted to be exactly like him. His hands formed fists at his sides. And then I watched rebels drag him into the courtyard and execute him while I screamed from a locked tower. Watched him die knowing the crown had allowed it to happen because he'd become too powerful and too beloved and too dangerous to their authority. I was 12 years old and completely helpless while the person I loved most in the world was murdered as a political maneuver. The fire crackled into the silence that followed. Wind rattled windows. Somewhere far away, guards changed shifts with the mechanical precision that governed all of Blackmir's operations. So you decided never to be helpless again, never to care about anyone enough that losing them would break you. Serafina's voice was soft but certain, putting pieces together that Kaedric had never explicitly stated, but that she'd apparently understood anyway. I decided that caring was a liability, that love made you weak, that the only way to survive in a world built on violence and betrayal was to become something incapable of the vulnerabilities that got good men killed. And it worked. You built absolute power, made yourself feared instead of beloved, created an empire where you controlled everything and needed no one. Yes. So why do you look so miserable? The question hit him like a physical blow because it stripped away every rationalization and forced him to confront what he'd been avoiding. He wasn't miserable because of external threats or political challenges or the constant pressure of rule. Those were manageable, expected. He was miserable because he'd won, achieved exactly what 15 years of ruthless calculation had been designed to accomplish, made himself invulnerable to the kind of pain that came from caring, and discovered that invulnerability felt exactly like being buried alive. Kaedric turned back to face Serafina and found her watching him with an expression that held no judgment, just recognition. Like she understood exactly what he was realizing in real time. You asked me yesterday what I want. I said survival was the only thing that mattered. And I think I was lying. The admission felt like stepping off a cliff, with no idea whether he'd fall or somehow manage to fly. Serafina moved closer, crossing the space between window and fireplace until she stood close enough that he could see the pulse beating in her throat. What do you actually want, Kaedric? No one had asked him that in years, maybe ever. People wanted things from him. Decisions, protection, permission, resources, power. But no one had asked what the Duke himself wanted, as though his desires mattered independently of strategic value. The answer rose in his throat before he could calculate whether saying it was safe. I want to stop being afraid that caring about anything will destroy me. Serafina's eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me. I know. It's also the most dangerous. Why? Because now you know exactly how to hurt me if you choose to. And in my experience, people always choose to. What if I don't? What if instead of using your vulnerability as a weapon, I just acknowledged that it exists and matched it with my own? She reached out slowly, telegraphing the movement like approaching something wild that might bolt. Her hand settled on his arm with gentle pressure that felt somehow louder than any words. I'm terrified too. Of being trapped here forever. Of my father's cowardice. Of what it means that I'm starting to see you as more than just my captor. But maybe being afraid together is less lonely than being afraid alone. Kaedric looked down at her hand on his arm. Such a small gesture. Simple physical contact. It shouldn't have felt monumental, but it did, because no one touched the Duke of Blackmir casually. People kept their distance out of fear or calculation or both. But Serafina was touching him like he was just a man. Like his reputation and power and ruthless efficiency were secondary to the fundamental humanity she insisted on seeing despite every reason not to. Something inside him cracked completely. Not broke. Cracked. Like ice starting to thaw after a winter so long he'd forgotten warmth was possible. This is a terrible idea. His voice came out rougher than intended, but he didn't pull away from her touch. Probably. Most honest things are. If this goes wrong, it could destroy everything I've built. Then we make sure it doesn't go wrong. You're suggesting we what exactly? Start caring about each other despite every strategic reason that's catastrophically stupid? Serafina smiled then, small and tired but genuine. I'm suggesting we stop pretending we don't already care and figure out what to do about it before the pretending kills us both from exhaustion. The truth of that statement settled over Kaedric like weight and relief combined. Because she was right. He'd been fighting feelings he couldn't name or control for weeks now, telling himself it was just fascination with someone unusual, strategic interest in understanding his leverage, anything except the obvious reality that Serafina Vale had somehow become important to him in ways that had nothing to do with her father's cooperation. And fighting it was taking more energy than he had left to spare. I don't know how to do this. The admission felt like surrender, but also like freedom. Acknowledgement that Duke Kaedric Raventhal, the North's most ruthless lord, had finally encountered something he couldn't solve through calculation alone. Neither do I. But I think we figure it out together, or we both suffocate under the weight of isolation we're each carrying. She squeezed his arm once and then released him, stepping back to restore space. Not retreating, just acknowledging they both needed room to process what had just shifted between them. I should go. Give you time to think about this without me standing here watching you calculate risk assessment in real time. Kaedric almost smiled despite everything. You're getting good at reading me. Someone has to. You're terrible at it yourself. She moved toward the door but paused before leaving, glancing back with an expression that held challenge and invitation combined. For what it's worth, I think the man underneath all that armor is worth knowing, even if he's spent 15 years convinced otherwise. Then she was gone, leaving Kaedric standing alone in his study while everything he'd built his existence around shifted like foundations, discovering they weren't as solid as advertised. He stood there for a long time trying to convince himself this was manageable, controllable, just another variable to account for in his strategic planning. But deep down, in the place he usually refused to acknowledge existed, Kaedric knew the truth. He'd spent 15 years building walls designed to keep everyone out and everything controlled. And Serafina had walked through them like they were made of paper. The next 3 days passed in strange suspension. Kaedric continued his normal routine: council sessions, military briefings, document review, the endless machinery of rule that demanded constant attention. But something fundamental had changed beneath the surface operations. He found himself aware of Serafina's presence in ways he couldn't quite suppress. When she entered rooms, how she moved through corridors, the sound of her voice during dinners in the Great Hall. And worse, he caught himself looking for her when she wasn't immediately visible, as though some part of him had decided that knowing where she was mattered more than strategic necessity alone could explain. His court noticed, of course. They always noticed. But no one dared comment after what happened to Lord Peter, so instead they watched, calculated, waited to see whether the Duke's attention toward his hostage represented genuine vulnerability or something else entirely. Serafina, for her part, seemed to be honoring some unspoken agreement to give him space. She attended required functions but didn't seek him out privately, participated in conversations but didn't force confrontations. It was almost like she understood he needed time to adjust to whatever had shifted between them in his study 3 days ago. But the space didn't help. If anything, it made things worse because Kaedric's mind kept returning to her words and his own admissions like a tongue probing a wound to see if it still hurt. I want to stop being afraid that caring about anything will destroy me. He'd said that. Actually articulated the fundamental terror he'd been running from for 15 years. And instead of using it against him, Serafina had offered her own vulnerability in return, like trust was something they could build together instead of weapons to be stored for future use. The concept was foreign enough to be almost incomprehensible. On the 4th day, everything collapsed. The messenger arrived just after dawn, mud-splattered and exhausted from hard riding. Marcus brought him directly to Kaedric's study, where the Duke was already working through morning reports. My lord, urgent dispatch from the Southern Territories. The man's expression communicated disaster before he'd spoken a word. Kaedric gestured for the sealed message, breaking the wax with movements that betrayed none of the tension suddenly coiling in his gut. He scanned the contents once, then again more slowly while cold understanding settled like ice in his veins. Duke Alaric Vale was dead. According to the report, he'd died 3 days ago in what was being officially described as a sudden illness. But the details suggested something far less natural. Convulsions, bleeding from the eyes and mouth, symptoms consistent with a particularly vicious poison favored by royal assassins. The crown had eliminated him, and that meant every calculation Kaedric had based on controlling Vale through his daughter had just become irrelevant. How long until this is public knowledge? Already spreading through the southern territories, my lord, will likely have confirmation from multiple sources within hours. Kaedric's mind shifted into the cold, analytical state he'd perfected over years of navigating political catastrophe. Alaric Vale's death changed everything. The agreements, the power structure, the reason for holding Seraphina hostage in the first place. She'd lost her strategic value the moment her father's heart stopped beating, which meant she was now just a woman living in Blackmere Keep with no political protection and no leverage preventing Kaedric from disposing of her however he deemed appropriate. His advisors would expect him to release her, send her back south with appropriate condolences and move on to more pressing concerns. His enemies would expect him to punish her for her father's betrayal or use her as a bargaining chip in whatever complex negotiations came next. But as Kaedric stared at the dispatch confirming Alaric Vale's death, all he could think about was Seraphina's face when he told her. The grief that would crash over her despite everything her father had done. The terror about what happened next now that she'd lost even the conditional protection his hostage status provided. And beneath that, darker and more uncomfortable, was the realization that Duke Alaric Vale's death had given him exactly what some buried part of himself had wanted. A reason to keep her here that had nothing to do with politics. The thought made him sick with self-awareness he usually avoided. Because this was who he'd become. A man whose first response to learning his hostage's father had been murdered was relief that it gave him justification to maintain control over the daughter. Possession disguised as protection. Seraphina had been right about him, right about the emotional cowardice and the way he reduced everything to strategy to avoid confronting what he actually felt. And now her father was dead, and he had to tell her and watch whatever fragile trust they'd started building shatter when she understood that even this, even her grief, was just another variable in his calculations. Prepare formal condolences for the southern houses. I'll need to draft responses to whatever political fallout follows. And Marcus? Yes, my lord? Send for Lady Seraphina. Tell her I need to speak with her immediately. Private audience. My study. The steward nodded and left to execute his orders while Kaedric stood at his window, watching storm clouds gather over the northern cliffs. He'd spent 15 years becoming someone who could make impossible decisions without hesitation, could deliver devastating news with perfect composure, could calculate human cost as just another resource to be managed. But right now, facing the prospect of telling Seraphina her father was dead and watching pain replace the careful understanding they'd been building, Duke Kaedric Raventhal felt like the 12-year-old locked in that tower again, helpless, terrified, and absolutely certain that caring about what happened next was going to destroy him. She arrived 20 minutes later wearing the dark blue again, her expression shifting from neutral to concerned the moment she read whatever she saw in his face. "What's wrong?" Kaedric gestured to the chairs by the fireplace. "Sit, please." The please made her more nervous. He never said please. She sat with rigid posture that broadcast tension while he took the chair across from her and tried to figure out how to deliver news that would break her despite everything. "There's no good way to say this, so I'll be direct. Your father is dead. He died 3 days ago in the Southern Territories. The official report claims sudden illness, but the symptoms suggest assassination, almost certainly royal agents." Seraphina's face went completely blank. Not shock exactly, more like something fundamental shutting down while her mind processed information too catastrophic to immediately comprehend. "You're lying." "No, I'm not. This is some kind of test. Some manipulation to see how I respond. I wish it were. But the intelligence is solid. Multiple confirmations. Your father is dead, Seraphina. I'm sorry." The last 2 words came out rougher than intended, but genuine. Because despite everything Alaric Vale had done, the treason, the cowardice, the willingness to sacrifice his daughter, he'd been Seraphina's father. And losing parents left wounds that never fully healed, no matter how complicated the relationship had been. Kaedric knew that intimately. Seraphina stood abruptly, movements sharp and uncoordinated. She walked to the window and stared out at nothing while her breathing accelerated towards something that might become panic or grief or both. He gave her time, didn't rush or try to provide empty comfort. Just let her process while the fire crackled and wind howled and the weight of her father's death settled over the room like smoke. Finally, She spoke without turning around. Was it because of our arrangement? Because he was cooperating with you? Possibly. More likely it was because the Crown saw him as a continued threat regardless of cooperation. Traitors don't get forgiven even when they turn. They get eliminated to prevent future problems. Her shoulders shook once, but she controlled it. So he died for nothing. His rebellion failed. His cooperation failed. He sacrificed me to you for protection he never actually had. Yes, the honesty was brutal, but she deserved truth instead of comforting lies. Alaric Vale had played political games with stakes he didn't fully understand and lost everything, including his life. Serafina finally turned to face him, and her eyes held something empty. What happens to me now? The question Kaedric had been dreading because answering it honestly meant revealing exactly how calculating he actually was. Strategically, you have no value anymore. Your father's death eliminates the leverage you represented. I have no political reason to keep you here as hostage, so you're sending me away. It wasn't quite a question, more like resigned acceptance that she'd lost even the terrible security of being valuable as a political prisoner. Kaedric stood and moved closer, watching her face carefully. I'm not sending you away. Then what? I'm offering you a choice. You can return to the Southern Territories. I'll provide escort and financial support to help you rebuild whatever life you want there. No obligations, complete freedom. Her expression shifted toward confusion. And the alternative? You stay here. Not as a hostage, as... He paused, searching for language that captured something he barely understood himself. As someone under my protection. Part of my household. Your status would change, but your presence wouldn't. Why would you offer that? Without my father's cooperation to leverage, I'm nothing to you strategically. The assessment was accurate and devastating in its recognition of how Kaedric operated, reducing people to utility, calculating value, making decisions based on strategic advantage rather than anything approaching human connection. But standing in his study watching Serafina process her father's death, while simultaneously wondering whether she was about to be discarded, he couldn't maintain that pretense anymore. You're right. Strategically, keeping you here makes no sense. It provides no advantage and considerable complications. My advisors would call it irrational. My enemies would call it weakness. Then why? Because the truth I've been avoiding for weeks is that I don't want you to leave. Not because you're useful, because you're... He struggled for words that felt impossibly vulnerable, important, in ways that have nothing to do with politics. Serafina stared at him like he'd started speaking a foreign language. You're saying you want me to stay because you care about me. I'm saying I care about you despite every strategic reason that's catastrophically stupid, and I'm giving you the choice about what happens next because I've spent enough time controlling your circumstances against your will. The admission hung between them with the weight of something that couldn't be taken back. Kaedric had just confessed feelings he'd spent years teaching himself not to have to a woman whose father he'd used as political leverage and whose grief he was watching in real time. It was possibly the worst timing in history, but it was also honest in ways he hadn't been with anyone in 15 years. Serafina's expression cracked completely. Tears spilled over despite obvious efforts to control them. Not delicate crying, the raw kind that came from accumulated loss finally breaking through whatever dam had been holding it back. My father is dead. I should feel devastated, but mostly I just feel angry. Angry that he was weak and cowardly and chose treason over integrity. Angry that he traded me to save himself and got killed anyway. Angry that even now, even learning he's gone, what I'm thinking about is whether you're manipulating me with convenient timing. Her voice broke on the last words, and suddenly she was moving toward him without seeming to decide to, closing the space between them until she stood close enough that Kaedric could see every detail of her face. The tears tracking down her cheeks, the exhaustion in her eyes, the complicated grief of losing a parent you'd already lost respect for years ago. Tell me this isn't manipulation. Tell me you're not offering protection and care as just another way to control someone. Kaedric reached up slowly and wiped tears from her face with his thumb, the gesture feeling simultaneously natural and terrifying. I could be lying, could be using your grief and vulnerability as leverage for something calculated. That's what the Duke of Blackmere would do. What everyone expects. And I'm tired of being only that. Tired of reducing every human interaction to strategy. Tired of being so afraid of vulnerability that I destroy any possibility of connection before it can threaten me. He kept his hand against her cheek and found himself saying things he hadn't planned. Things that probably shouldn't be said while she was processing her father's death, but that felt necessary anyway. Your father is dead, and I'm sorry for your loss, even though he was a coward who deserved his fate. You're free to leave, and I'll help you build whatever life you want elsewhere. But if you choose to stay, it won't be as a hostage or a political tool. It'll be because we're both tired of being alone, and maybe we can figure out how to be less broken together. Serafina's eyes searched his face like she was looking for the lie beneath the words. The manipulation, the trap. But whatever she found there made something shift in her expression. This is insane. My father just died. You held me hostage for weeks. Everything about this situation is damaged and complicated and probably doomed from the start. Yes. So why does it feel like the first honest thing anyone's offered me in years? Because it is. And because we're both damaged enough to recognize honesty when it appears, even if we can't quite trust it yet. They stood like that for a long moment. Close enough that the air between them felt charged with something that had nothing to do with politics or strategy. Everything to do with two people who'd spent too long performing survival and were desperately, dangerously close to dropping the armor completely. Then Serafina kissed him. Not hesitant or tentative, hard and almost desperate, like she was trying to prove something or destroy something, or possibly both at once. Her hands fisted in his shirt and dragged him closer while grief and anger and something else entirely poured into the kiss with raw intensity. Kedrick responded before conscious thought could intervene, pulled her against him with the kind of possession he'd been fighting for weeks. Let 15 years of controlled isolation crack completely under the pressure of actually feeling something beyond strategic calculation. It was reckless, stupid, exactly the kind of emotional vulnerability he'd spent half his life avoiding. And it felt like the first time he'd breathed properly since he was 12 years old. They broke apart eventually, both breathing hard, and Serafina's eyes held something fierce. I'm staying, not because I have nowhere else to go, because I choose this. Choose you, despite every reason it's a terrible idea. The word struck Kedrick with devastating force because chosen was something he'd never been. People obeyed him from fear, cooperated from calculation. Served him because he had power they wanted access to. But Serafina was choosing him. Not the Duke, not the reputation, the actual damaged, isolated, terrified man underneath. This is going to be complicated. Everything worth having is. My court will talk. My enemies will see weakness. Keeping you here without political justification will create problems I'll have to navigate. Then navigate them. You're supposedly the most ruthless strategist in the kingdom. Figure it out. She said it with the ghost of a smile despite the tears still wet on her face. Challenge and invitation and grief all tangled together. And Kedrick realized with uncomfortable clarity that she was right. He'd spent 15 years building absolute power through ruthless calculation. Surely he could protect one woman who'd somehow become essential to him without destroying everything in the process. Or he'd fail spectacularly and learn that emotional vulnerability really was the death sentence he'd always feared. Either way, standing in his study with Serafina's taste still on his lips and her choice still echoing in his ears, Duke Kedrick Raventhal understood one fundamental truth. He'd reached the point of no return. The careful control he'd maintained for years had cracked completely. The isolation he'd used as armor had become a cage he desperately wanted to escape. And the woman he'd taken as political hostage had transformed into something far more dangerous than any enemy. She'd become someone he cared about protecting more than he cared about protecting himself. And in a world built on violence and betrayal and ruthless political calculation, that made her both his greatest vulnerability and possibly the only thing worth fighting for. The storm that had been gathering over Blackmere Keep finally broke that night, wind howling like something alive and desperate while snow battered the fortress walls. And inside, Duke Kedrick Raventhal held Serafina Vale close and wondered whether choosing humanity over survival would save him or destroy everything he'd built from the ruins of a 12-year-old's screams. He suspected he was about to find out. The fortress woke to false peace. Morning light filtered through storm-battered windows, while servants moved through corridors with the mechanical efficiency that governed all of Blackmere's operations. Guards changed shifts. Merchants arrived with supply wagons. The machinery of rule continued its relentless grinding forward, as though nothing fundamental had shifted in the night. But Kedrick knew better. He stood at his study window watching dawn break over the cliffs, and felt the weight of what he'd chosen settling into his bones like lead. Serafina was still sleeping in the guest quarters, her choice to maintain separate rooms until they figured out what this actually was, and he'd let her rest because grief needed time to process, and exhaustion demanded its due. But sleep had abandoned him completely around 3 in the morning, when the full implications of keeping her here without political justification had crashed through his strategic calculations like rocks through glass. His advisors would question the decision. His enemies would exploit it. The delicate power structure he'd spent 15 years building could fracture under the perception that Duke Kedrick Raventhal had finally shown weakness by prioritizing personal desire over strategic necessity. And the truly terrifying part was that he didn't care as much as he should. Somewhere between watching Serafina's tears and feeling her choose him despite every reason not to, Kedrick had crossed a line he'd sworn never to approach. He'd let someone matter more than survival, let vulnerability crack through armor that was supposed to be impenetrable. His father had made the same mistake, had cared too much about justice and honor and protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. And that caring had gotten him murdered in a castle courtyard while his 12-year-old son screamed helplessly from a tower. The memory should have been warning enough to pull back. Rebuild distance. Protect himself before this new vulnerability could be weaponized by enemies who would absolutely use it to destroy him. But when Kedrick closed his eyes, all he saw was Serafina's face when she'd said she was choosing him. Not the Duke, not the power. The actual broken man underneath who'd spent 15 years convinced he was incapable of connection. And that memory was stronger than fear. For now, the knock interrupted his thoughts with the sharp precision that meant Marcus bringing morning reports. Kedrick turned from the window and called permission to enter, while his mind shifted into the cold analytical state that governed most of his waking hours. His steward appeared carrying documents and wearing an expression that communicated concern despite obvious efforts at professional neutrality. My lord, several matters requiring immediate attention. He set papers on the desk with careful organization. Tax assessments, military readiness reports, intelligence from border patrols, the endless documentation that kept northern territories functioning under harsh conditions. But Marcus didn't leave after delivering the materials, just stood there with the particular tension that meant something else needed saying. What is it? The older man chose his words carefully. Lord Theron requested private audience this morning. He's concerned about the Lady Serafina's continued presence, given her father's death. Several other council members share his concerns. Of course they did. Kedrick had expected this. His inner circle functioned on ruthless pragmatism, and Serafina had lost her strategic value the moment Duke Vale died. Keeping her here without political justification would seem like exactly the kind of emotional compromise that got rulers destroyed. Tell Lord Theron I'll see him after breakfast. And Marcus. Yes, my lord? Make it clear that Lady Serafina's status is not open for debate. Her presence here is my decision and my concern. Anyone who disagrees can bring their objections directly to me rather than spreading doubt through the court. The steward nodded, but his expression suggested the message wouldn't stop speculation. Probably make it worse by confirming that the Duke was prioritizing personal interest over political wisdom. Kedrick dismissed him and turned back to the windows. Snow had started falling again, heavy flakes that blurred the landscape into white emptiness. Beautiful and deadly if you weren't prepared for it. He'd need to be very prepared for what was coming, because his enemies wouldn't waste this opportunity. They'd been waiting years for the ruthless Duke of Blackmere to show human weakness. Now he'd handed them exactly that by keeping a woman who no longer provided strategic value. The question was whether he could protect her and maintain power simultaneously, or whether choosing one would cost him the other. Breakfast in the Great Hall felt like walking into an ambush disguised as normal routine. Kedrick arrived to find his usual inner circle already seated. Lord Theron, Lady Morgana, who controlled significant merchant operations, Lord Davos, who managed tax collection, and several military commanders whose names mattered less than their careful observation of everything happening at the high table. Serafina entered 10 minutes later wearing black today, mourning colors appropriate for someone who'd just lost a parent. Her eyes showed evidence of crying, but her composure was perfect as she crossed the hall and took her seat 20 feet from where Kedrick sat. The assembled court watched with predatory interest, waiting to see how the Duke treated his hostage now that she'd stopped being useful as leverage. Kedrick acknowledged her arrival with a slight nod. Professional. Appropriate. nothing that suggested intimacy or special consideration. But he noticed the way her shoulders relaxed fractionally at the recognition. The small confirmation that yesterday's conversation had been real and not something she'd imagined in grief-induced desperation. Breakfast proceeded through multiple courses while conversation flowed around topics carefully chosen to avoid direct confrontation. Military readiness, trade routes, tax assessments, everyone performing normalcy while tension hummed beneath every word. Finally, Lord Theron broke protocol by addressing the Duke directly during the meal, instead of waiting for private audience. "My lord, if I may raise a matter of immediate concern. Given Duke Vale's death, several council members are unclear about Lady Seraphina's continued status here. Her presence was justified as hostage, guaranteeing her father's cooperation. Without that justification, we're uncertain about the arrangement's purpose." The hall went quiet immediately. This was the challenge everyone had been anticipating since news of Alaric Vale's assassination reached Blackmere. Direct question about whether the Duke's decisions were still governed by strategic calculation or something far more dangerous. Cadric set down his cup with deliberate precision. The small sound seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. "Lady Seraphina remains here under my protection as a member of my household. Her father's death eliminates her status as political hostage, but doesn't change my responsibility toward her safety and well-being." Theron's expression betrayed nothing, but his next words carried careful weight. "Of course, my lord. Though some might wonder what strategic value that responsibility provides given the changed circumstances." The implied criticism was clear. The Duke was making decisions based on personal interest instead of political necessity. That represented vulnerability that enemies would exploit and that his own advisors found concerning. Cadric could shut this down immediately with cold authority. Remind everyone that questioning his judgment was dangerous. Make Theron regret raising the issue publicly. But he'd spent 15 years ruling through fear, and it hadn't made him less isolated, just more powerful and more alone. So instead he did something unexpected. He told the truth. "You're right, Lord Theron. Keeping Lady Seraphina here provides no strategic advantage. In fact, it creates complications and invites exactly the kind of speculation you're raising now." Confusion rippled through the assembled court. The Duke was admitting weakness, acknowledging that his decision lacked political justification. However, Cadric's voice hardened slightly. "Strategy isn't the only consideration that governs my decisions. Lady Seraphina has lost her father and her security. She has nowhere else to go that's safe from the same forces that eliminated Duke Vale. Providing her sanctuary is the decent thing to do regardless of whether it advances my political interests." The statement landed like a stone thrown into still water, ripples of shock spreading outward as nobles processed what they'd just heard. Duke Cadric Raventhal had just prioritized decency over strategy. The ruthless lord who'd built his reputation on cold calculation and absolute pragmatism had openly admitted to making a decision based on human compassion. It should have felt like victory, like finally stepping out from behind the armor and letting people see he was more than just the monster of reputation. Instead, it felt like handing loaded weapons to everyone present and hoping they wouldn't immediately use them to destroy him. Lady Morgana spoke next, her voice carrying the particular skepticism of someone who'd survived court politics through careful cynicism. "Forgive me, my lord, but decency is a curious justification from a man who's executed traitors publicly and seized estates without hesitation. Some might interpret this sudden compassion as," she paused delicately, "compromised judgment." The accusation was more direct than Theron's carefully worded concern. Morgana was suggesting that Seraphina had somehow manipulated the Duke into protective feelings that undermined his famous ruthlessness. Cadric met her eyes with the kind of cold intensity that had made him feared throughout the kingdom. And some might remember that questioning my judgment openly is an excellent way to discover exactly how ruthless I remain when dealing with threats to my authority. The temperature in the hall dropped noticeably. Several people shifted in their seats. Morgana went pale but held her ground with visible effort. But he wasn't finished. "Lady Seraphina has manipulated nothing. I'm making this decision with full awareness of its political implications because I choose to. Because spending 15 years becoming something incapable of basic human decency hasn't made me stronger. It's made me isolated and empty and increasingly uncertain whether power without purpose is worth the cost of maintaining it." The confession was more honest than he'd intended. Vulnerability laid bare before 40 people who could use it against him. But watching Seraphina's expression from 20 feet away, the surprise and something that might have been pride, made the risk feel almost worthwhile. Almost. Lord Theron leaned forward slightly. With respect, my lord, that kind of uncertainty is precisely what concerns us. The Duke of Blackmere cannot afford to question whether power is worthwhile. Your strength keeps the Northern Territories stable. Your reputation prevents challenges from houses that would tear us apart if they sensed weakness. He's right, Lord Davos added his voice to the growing challenge. We understand compassion, my lord. But compassion that compromises your authority puts everyone here at risk. If your enemies believe you've been softened by personal attachment, they'll attack. And all of us will pay the price for your moment of humanity. The argument was logical, strategic. Everything Caedric would have said himself a month ago, before Seraphina had walked into his fortress and made isolation feel less like protection and more like slow death. But logic that made sense in theory felt different when applied to someone you'd started caring about, despite every rational reason not to. I understand your concerns, and I appreciate your loyalty in raising them directly, rather than plotting behind my back. Caedric's voice carried the weight of absolute authority even while acknowledging their points. But Lady Seraphina stays, under my protection, as part of my household. Anyone who has problems with that arrangement is welcome to leave Blackmere and find service elsewhere. Anyone who stays and continues undermining that decision will learn exactly how ruthless I become when my explicit orders are questioned. The threat was clear and genuine. Comply or leave. Obey or face consequences. It should have been enough. But Caedric could see calculation happening behind multiple sets of eyes, his advisors processing this new information, deciding whether the Duke's admission of personal attachment represented temporary weakness or permanent vulnerability. And he knew with cold certainty that some of them would choose wrong. The meal continued in uncomfortable silence. Eventually, people began excusing themselves, conversations resuming in hushed tones once they'd cleared the hall's oppressive atmosphere. Seraphina remained seated longer than necessary, clearly waiting until others had dispersed before approaching. Finally, she stood and walked along the high table until she stopped beside his chair. That was either incredibly brave or catastrophically stupid. Her voice was quiet enough that remaining servants couldn't hear, but her eyes held concern mixed with something that looked almost like fear. Caedric stood as well, maintaining the physical formality that court protocol demanded, even while everything between them had shifted into territory that had nothing to do with formality. Probably both, but it was also honest. And I'm tired of lying about what matters to me. You just painted a target on both our backs. I know. They're going to use this against you. Your enemies will see weakness. Your allies will question your judgment. Everything you've built could collapse because you admitted to caring about someone. The assessment was accurate and devastating in its recognition of how precarious his position had just become. But standing there looking at Seraphina's face, the worry, and the complicated gratitude and the exhaustion of constantly performing survival, Caedric found he couldn't regret the choice. Not yet, anyway. Let them try. I've been preparing for attacks my entire life. At least now I'm fighting for something that matters, instead of just fighting to maintain power for its own sake. Seraphina's expression cracked slightly. You're going to get yourself killed trying to protect me. Possibly. But I'm already dying slowly from isolation. At least this way, if everything collapses, it'll be because I chose something human instead of just surviving as a monster everyone fears. He wanted to touch her, pull her close and confirm physically that yesterday hadn't been grief-induced delusion. But too many eyes were still watching, and he'd already given them enough ammunition for one morning. So instead, he just looked at her and hoped she understood everything he couldn't say in a room full of potential enemies. Go rest. You need time to process your father's death without court politics making everything more complicated. What about you? I need to start preparing for whatever comes next. Because Lord Theron was right about one thing. My enemies will absolutely interpret this as weakness, and I'll need to be ready when they come. Seraphina nodded but didn't move immediately. Just stood there for a moment looking at him with an expression that held too many complicated emotions to parse individually. Then she spoke so quietly he almost missed it. Thank you for choosing me, even knowing what it might cost. Before he could respond, she turned and left the hall, while Caedric stood alone at the high table trying to convince himself that choosing humanity over survival had been the right decision, even though every strategic instinct he possessed was screaming that he'd just made a fatal mistake. The summons arrived 3 days later. Caedric was reviewing military assessments when Marcus entered carrying a sealed message bearing the crown's official insignia. The older man's face communicated disaster before speaking a single word. "Royal dispatch, my lord. Urgent and marked for your immediate attention." Caedric broke the wax seal and scanned the contents, while cold understanding settled in his chest like swallowed ice. The king requested his presence at the capital within 2 weeks. Mandatory attendance, no exceptions. The language was diplomatic, but the subtext was clear as broken glass. This was about Seraphina. Somehow, impossibly fast, news had reached the crown that Duke Caedric Raventhal was keeping Alaric Vale's daughter at Blackmere without political justification. That the North's most ruthless lord had admitted publicly to prioritizing personal attachment over strategic calculation. And the king wanted to discuss whether that represented the kind of compromised judgment that required intervention. How did they find out this quickly? Marcus's expression turned grim. Someone at that breakfast sent word south immediately. Probably multiple someones. Your admission about Lady Seraphina would have been too valuable as intelligence not to report. Betrayal from within his own court. People he'd trusted, or at least believed were sufficiently afraid of him to remain loyal, had sold information to the crown the moment they'd sensed potential weakness. Caedric's hands formed fists on the desk. Who? Unknown yet, my lord, but given the speed of the dispatch, likely someone with direct access to royal communication channels. High-ranking noble, possibly military commander. The list of suspects was shorter than he'd like. People with both access and motivation to undermine him by reporting to the crown. His inner circle. The very advisors who'd questioned his judgment during that breakfast. He'd been so focused on external enemies that he'd missed the knives being sharpened by people standing right beside him. Stupid. Careless. Exactly the kind of mistake that got rulers destroyed when they let personal feelings compromise situational awareness. Prepare my travel arrangements. I'll leave for the capital in 5 days. And Lady Seraphina? The question hung heavy with implications. Taking her meant bringing his vulnerability directly to the king's attention. Leaving her meant abandoning her to whatever schemes his enemies might execute in his absence. Neither option was good. She comes with me. Under guard escort. I'm not leaving her here where she's vulnerable while I'm unable to protect her. Marcus nodded and left to execute orders while Caedric stood at his window, staring at nothing and trying to calculate how badly he'd miscalculated by letting anyone see he cared about something. Beyond power. The answer was forming with devastating clarity. Very badly indeed. That evening, Caedric found Seraphina in the library, a room he'd given her access to weeks ago during her hostage period. She sat near the fireplace reading something that she set aside immediately when he entered. One look at his face told her everything she needed to know. What happened? The crown summoned me to the capital. Someone from breakfast reported my admission about you. Now the king wants to discuss whether my judgment has been compromised. Seraphina stood slowly, processing implications faster than he'd expected. They're going to force you to give me up. Prove your loyalty by abandoning personal attachment, possibly, or they'll use you as leverage to control me. Force political concessions by threatening your safety. Either way, keeping you has made both of us vulnerable to exactly the kind of manipulation I've spent my career avoiding. He moved closer to the fire, kneading its warmth against the cold settling deeper into his bones. I should have sent you south when your father died. Protected you by creating distance, instead of making you a target by keeping you close. Seraphina crossed to where he stood and her eyes held complicated emotion. You're regretting your choice. No, but I'm recognizing its cost more clearly than I did 3 days ago, when making it seem noble instead of catastrophically naive. There's still time. You could send me away now. Arrive at the capital having already corrected the perceived mistake. Show the king that your moment of weakness has passed. The suggestion was logical, strategic, everything his advisors would recommend. Cut losses, protect his position, prove that personal attachment hadn't permanently compromised his judgment. But the thought of sending Seraphina away, of choosing power over the first genuine connection he'd felt in 15 years, made something in his chest constrict painfully. Is that what you want? To be sent away where you're safe from the complications I've created? Seraphina laughed bitterly. What I want is irrelevant. I'm a widowed daughter of a dead traitor with no political value and no leverage. My preferences don't factor into decisions made by men with actual power. That's not an answer. Fine. No. I don't want to be sent away. I don't want to lose the one person who's seen past my anger and grief to something worth choosing. But I also don't want to be the reason the Duke of Blackmere loses everything he's built. So maybe what I want doesn't matter as much as what's necessary for survival. The words hit harder than intended because they articulated exactly what Caedric had been wrestling with since the summons arrived. The impossible choice between protecting what he'd built and protecting what had started to matter more. He reached out and pulled her close, despite knowing it was probably the worst possible decision given current circumstances. She came without resistance, her head settling against his chest, while his arms wrapped around her with the kind of fierce possession he'd been fighting for weeks. I'm bringing you to the capital, under my protection. Whatever the king wants to discuss, we'll face it together instead of me abandoning you to make political calculations easier. That's not strategic. No, but it's honest. And I'm done sacrificing everything human about myself to maintain power that's left me empty and isolated. Serafina pulled back enough to look at his face. You're willing to risk your entire position for someone you've known a few months? I'm willing to risk everything to finally stop being the monster my trauma created. You asked me what I wanted. This is it. Connection that matters more than fear, purpose beyond just surviving. Something worth protecting, even if protecting it costs me everything. The confession was more vulnerable than anything he'd said before. Complete abandonment of strategic distance in favor of raw honesty. And Serafina's expression cracked into something that looked like grief and hope tangled together. You understand they're going to destroy you for this. The crown, your enemies, everyone who's waited years for you to show weakness. Probably. But at least I'll go down fighting for something real instead of just protecting emptiness. He kissed her then, hard and desperate, like a man trying to memorize sensation before everything collapsed. She responded with equal intensity, her hands fisting in his shirt, while the library fire crackled and shadows danced across walls, and for a brief moment nothing existed except this. Eventually, they broke apart, and Caedric rested his forehead against hers while trying to steady breathing that had gone ragged. We leave in 5 days. Pack light. Travel will be hard and dangerous. And once we reach the capital, everything becomes exponentially more complicated. I know. Are you sure about this? Once we're there, if things go badly, I might not be able to protect you from consequences. Serafina's eyes held fierce certainty. I'm sure. We survive this together, or we fail together. But I'm done running from powerful men who think I'm disposable. The words settled something fundamental in Caedric's chest. They were choosing each other despite catastrophic risk, building connection in the ruins of everything that had tried to destroy them both. It was either the bravest thing he'd ever done, or the stupidest. He suspected he'd find out which very soon. The betrayal came on the 3rd day. Caedric was in his study finalizing travel arrangements when the doors burst open without warning. Lord Theron entered, flanked by 4 guards whose expressions communicated grim purpose. Caedric's hand moved instinctively toward the blade he kept within reach. What is this? Theron's face held no apology, no hesitation, just cold certainty that what came next was necessary and justified. My lord, I'm placing you under house arrest by order of the Northern Council. You're confined to Blackmere Keep, pending investigation into compromised judgment and potential treason against the Crown's interests. The words landed like physical blows. House arrest. Investigation, treason. His own military commander, the man he'd trusted with security operations for 10 years, had just turned against him. Caedric stood slowly, every muscle coiled for violence. Explain, now. We've received intelligence that your relationship with Lady Serafina represents foreign manipulation, that she's working with remaining Vale conspirators to influence your decisions and undermine Northern loyalty to the Crown. That's insane. Her father is dead. She has no political connections. Does she? Or did Duke Vale's assassination conveniently eliminate the only person who could confirm or deny his daughter's true allegiances? Theron moved closer with the confidence of someone who'd already won. Think about it, my lord. She arrives as hostage, somehow manipulates you into keeping her here without justification, convinces the most ruthless strategist in the kingdom to publicly admit compromised judgment, and now you're preparing to bring her directly to the capital where she'll have access to the king himself. The logic was twisted but superficially plausible to anyone predisposed to believe the Duke had been compromised. Build a conspiracy theory around Serafina's presence. Use Kaedric's own admission about caring for her as evidence of manipulation. It was elegant in its viciousness, and it was complete fabrication by someone who wanted him neutralized. Who gave you this intelligence? Royal sources. Confirmed by multiple channels. The council voted unanimously to detain you pending investigation. For your own protection and the security of the Northern Territories. Kaedric's mind raced through calculations faster than conscious thought. The council had turned against him. Theron was executing a coordinated coup disguised as protective intervention, and somewhere behind all of this was someone who'd been planning this for weeks. Where is Lady Seraphina? Safe. In custody. She'll be questioned separately to determine her actual involvement in whatever scheme she's running. The casual mention of questioning made Kaedric's blood run cold. Questioning in situations like this meant torture. Brutal interrogation designed to extract confessions regardless of truth. They were going to hurt her to build their case against him. And he'd brought this down on both of them by admitting he cared. Listen to me very carefully, Lord Theron. Whatever you think you're doing, whatever orders you believe you're following, this is a mistake that will cost you everything. His voice carried the kind of cold fury that had made him feared throughout the kingdom. But Theron didn't flinch. The only mistake was yours, my lord. You let personal attachment compromise your judgment, made yourself vulnerable to manipulation by a woman whose loyalties were never verified. The Northern Territories can't afford that kind of weakness from their duke. He gestured to the guards. Secure him. No visitors, no external communication. And make sure Lady Seraphina is transported to secure holding where she can't cause further damage. The guards moved forward with weapons drawn. 4 men who'd served under Kaedric's command for years, who'd sworn loyalty and taken his coin and benefited from the power he'd built. Now they were pointing swords at him because someone had convinced them their duke was compromised. Kaedric could fight, take down 2, maybe 3, before numbers overwhelmed him. But killing his own guards would confirm everything Theron was accusing him of, prove he'd become irrational and dangerous. So instead, he did the hardest thing he'd ever done. He surrendered, not because he accepted their accusations, but because fighting now meant Seraphina would definitely be hurt while he was unable to protect her. Better to cooperate temporarily, figure out who was orchestrating this, find leverage to reverse the situation before everything collapsed completely. It was strategic thinking born from 15 years of surviving impossible situations. But watching his own guards bind his hands while his military commander orchestrated a coup, Kaedric understood with devastating clarity that strategy might not be enough this time, because he'd finally let someone matter more than power. And his enemies had been waiting for exactly that vulnerability to destroy him. The cell they put him in was deep in Blackmir's lower levels, where summer warmth never reached, and winter cold settled into stone like permanent occupation. Not the dungeons where criminals awaited execution. Somewhere worse. The chambers where political prisoners were held when quick death was too merciful. Kaedric sat on the stone bench that served as furniture and tried to maintain the cold analytical state that had gotten him through every other crisis. Calculate who was behind this. Identify their true objectives. Find the weakness in their plan. But all he could think about was Seraphina. Where they were holding her. Whether they were hurting her. What kind of interrogation she was enduring while he sat here helpless and bound by circumstances he'd created through the catastrophic mistake of admitting he cared. His father had died because caring made you vulnerable. Now Kaedric was learning that lesson all over again from a cell deep beneath the fortress he'd built to protect himself from ever being helpless again. Time passed with no reference except the guttering torch outside his door. Hours, maybe a full day. No food, no water. No information about what was happening above, just silence and cold, and the weight of understanding that everything he'd built over 15 years was collapsing because he'd finally chosen something human over strategic necessity. Eventually, footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. The cell door opened to reveal not Theron, but someone worse. Lady Morgana entered with 2 guards flanking her, expression carefully neutral. Duke Raventhal. I hope your accommodations are adequately uncomfortable. Kaedric stood slowly, despite the chains restricting movement. What do you want? To explain exactly what's happening, and offer you a choice about how this ends. She moved closer with the confidence of someone who held all advantages. Lord Theron executed the arrest, but this operation was mine from the beginning. I've spent 18 months building the coalition that just removed you from power. Your admission about Lady Seraphina simply accelerated a timeline I'd already established. The confession was casual, almost bored, like detailing strategy after the game was already won. Why? Morgana smiled without warmth. Because you're a brilliant tactician and terrible politician, Duke Raventhal. You built absolute power through fear and military strength, but you never built actual loyalty, never created bonds that would survive the moment you showed human weakness. She gestured broadly. Everyone here obeys you because they're terrified of consequences. But terror doesn't inspire genuine allegiance. It just makes people wait for the right opportunity to remove the source of their fear. You gave me that opportunity when you admitted caring about a politically worthless woman. The logic was sound and devastating. Kadric had built his power on fear because fear was supposed to be more reliable than loyalty. But fear-based rule meant everyone was just waiting for him to stumble. And he'd stumbled spectacularly by letting Seraphina matter. What did you do with her? Morgana's expression shifted to something almost pitying. She's alive. Uncomfortable, but unharmed. For now. Her fate depends entirely on your cooperation with what comes next. Which is, you'll sign documents transferring temporary authority over the Northern Territories to an emergency council pending royal investigation. You'll publicly admit your judgment was compromised by foreign manipulation. And you'll formally request the Crown execute Lady Seraphina as a traitor who infiltrated your household. The demands landed with crushing finality. Complete capitulation, public humiliation, and the execution of the one person he'd chosen over power. Refuse, and Lady Seraphina dies slowly and painfully while you watch from this cell. Cooperate, and I'll ensure her death is quick. Merciful. You won't have to carry the guilt of knowing she suffered because you cared. Kadric's mind raced through desperate calculations, looking for the angle, the weakness, the leverage that would let him reverse this catastrophic situation. But Morgana had planned too well, cut off every avenue of escape, used his own admission of caring as the weapon that would force him to either sacrifice Seraphina or destroy himself trying to save her. It was the kind of trap he would have designed if their positions were reversed. Perfect, inescapable, and absolutely ruthless. You're asking me to sign her death warrant. I'm offering you a choice about how she dies. After everything you've done to her, taking her hostage, using her as leverage, making her a target by keeping her close, you owe her at least a quick end. The words were designed to wound by articulating the guilt he'd been avoiding, that his decisions had brought Seraphina to this point, that caring about her had made her vulnerable to enemies who'd use her as weapon against him, that choosing humanity over survival had doomed them both. How long do I have to decide? Until dawn tomorrow. Then we start questioning Lady Seraphina using methods that will get us the confession we need, regardless of what's actually true. Morgana moved toward the door, pausing at the threshold. You were the most feared man in the kingdom, Duke Raventhal. Ruthless, cold, impossible to manipulate because you cared about nothing except power. But the moment you let yourself want something beyond survival, you became as vulnerable as every other man who's ever been destroyed by what he loved. Then she left him alone in the cell while her words echoed in stone darkness. And Kadric sat there for hours trying to figure out how to save Seraphina from consequences of his choices while chained in a dungeon beneath the fortress he'd built to protect himself from ever being this helpless again. The answer came slowly, painfully, with the kind of devastating clarity that felt like something vital breaking inside his chest. There was only one way to save her. He had to become the monster everyone feared again. Not the man who'd admitted to caring, not the Duke trying to be something more human than his trauma had created. The absolute ruthless killer who'd built power through violence and maintained it through terror that made even thinking about betrayal too dangerous to consider. He had to stop being what Seraphina had made him want to become and return completely to what survival had demanded he be. A creature incapable of vulnerability, immune to manipulation through attachment, cold and calculating and willing to sacrifice anything, including his own humanity, to win. It meant abandoning everything he'd started to build with Seraphina. The connection, the hope, the possibility that he could be something more than just the sum of his trauma and survival instincts. But it also meant she lived, and in the impossible calculus of caring about someone more than power, that was the only calculation that mattered. Kadric closed his eyes and felt the last pieces of warmth drain from his chest like blood from an opened vein. Then he started planning exactly how Duke Kadric Raventhal would remind everyone why they'd been right to fear him in the first place. even if it meant destroying the man Serafina had chosen. Even if it meant becoming the monster again. Even if it cost him everything he'd almost been. Because survival demanded sacrifice. And he'd just learned the most devastating lesson about caring. That sometimes loving someone meant becoming the very thing that could save them. No matter how much it killed who you'd wanted to be. Dawn arrived like an executioner's blade cutting through darkness. Kedrick had spent the night in his cell, not sleeping, but calculating with the cold precision that had built his reputation over 15 years. Every guard rotation. Every structural weakness in Blackmir's lower levels. Every person who might still fear him enough to hesitate when he made his move. Because he was going to make a move. Not the surrender Morgana expected. Not the broken capitulation of a man defeated by caring too much. Something far more dangerous that required him to become exactly what he'd spent weeks trying to move beyond. The monster who'd learned that survival meant being willing to burn everything down if necessary. His hands were still bound, but chains were just metal, and metal had breaking points if you understood leverage and physics and were willing to endure the pain of testing both. He'd spent hours working the restraints against the stone bench edge, grinding away at weak links while skin tore and blood made his palms slick. The physical damage didn't matter. Pain was just information the body provided, and he'd learned long ago to process that information without letting it control decisions. What mattered was being ready when opportunity arrived. It came with the changing of the guard just after dawn. 2 men instead of the usual 4 because Morgana had gotten overconfident. Believed her trap was perfect enough that the captured Duke couldn't possibly escape from locked cells deep in his own fortress. She'd forgotten the fundamental lesson about caging predators. They're most dangerous when they have nothing left to lose. The cell door opened and the first guard entered carrying what might have been breakfast or possibly instruments for interrogation. Kedrick didn't wait to find out which. He moved with explosive violence that came from hours of coiled tension finally released. The weakened chain snapped with a sound like breaking bones. And suddenly his hands were free and driving forward into the guard's throat with enough force to crush his windpipe before he could scream. The man went down choking and dying while Kedrick was already turning toward the second guard, whose sword was only halfway drawn before Kedrick's boot connected with his knee in a strike that shattered bone and sent him collapsing with a scream that died when Kedrick's fist caved in his temple. 2 men down in less than 5 seconds. Clean, efficient, absolutely ruthless. This was who Duke Kedrick Raventhal actually was underneath every attempt at humanity. A killer who'd survived by being faster and more brutal than anyone who tried to destroy him. He took the first guard's sword and keys, checked the corridor for additional threats, then moved with purpose toward where they'd be holding Serafina. Not the cells. Somewhere more secure where Morgana could control access and ensure interrogation happened without witnesses. The old torture chambers 3 levels down, where screams couldn't reach inhabited areas. Kedrick moved through corridors he'd memorized years ago during fortress security assessments. Every turn, every guard post, every blind approach that allowed movement without detection. His own paranoia about potential siege had created the perfect map for internal infiltration. He encountered 2 more guards on the stairs leading down. They died before recognizing the blood-covered figure emerging from shadows was their Duke. Quick throat cuts, bodies hidden in alcoves. No time for anything except forward momentum toward wherever they were keeping her. The torture chamber door was locked, but Kedrick had keys from the dead guard and the knowledge that thick oak could be breached if you understood structural weak points. He worked the lock while his mind calculated what he'd find inside. Best case, Serafina alive and relatively unharmed. Worst case, interrogation already started with damage that couldn't be undone. The lock clicked open. Kedrick pushed through the door with sword ready and murder in his eyes. The chamber was exactly as brutal as he remembered from the one time he'd used it years ago. Stone walls, iron implements hanging from hooks, a chair in the center with restraints designed to immobilize while maximizing pain. Serafina sat bound to that chair. Her dress was torn, blood on her lip where someone had struck her, bruises forming on her arms. But her eyes were clear and furious rather than broken, and when she saw him they widened with shock that shifted immediately to something like relief mixed with terror. Behind her stood one of Morgana's men with a blade pressed to Serafina's throat. Not killing yet. Waiting. Because this was another trap. Kedrick. Serafina's voice came out rough but steady. Don't. It's not worth it. The guard pressed the blade harder, drawing a thin line of blood. Drop the sword, Duke, or I open her throat right now. Every tactical instinct Kaedric possessed screamed that he was walking into exactly what Morgana wanted. Emotional response overriding strategic thinking, caring about Seraphina more than survival. But looking at her tied to that chair with a blade at her throat, he discovered something fundamental about the man he'd become over the past weeks. He'd rather die trying to save her than survive by calculating her as acceptable loss. That wasn't weakness. It was the only choice that mattered when you finally found something worth protecting more than power. He dropped the sword. The guard smiled with vicious satisfaction. Smart decision. Lady Morgana will be pleased you're being cooperative. Movement exploded from the shadows to his left. 3 more guards emerging with crossbows aimed at his chest. The chamber had been staged perfectly. Multiple threats. Overwhelming force. Escape impossible without Seraphina dying in the process. Morgana entered last, expression carrying smug vindication. Duke Raventhal. I'm almost impressed you made it this far. Though killing 4 of my men was unnecessary violence that will be added to your list of crimes. She moved closer while guards maintained weapons trained on him from multiple angles. But ultimately, futile. You're here. Disarmed. Surrounded. And your desperate attempt to rescue Lady Seraphina has simply confirmed everything I've been saying about compromised judgment. Kaedric's eyes never left the blade at Seraphina's throat. Let her go. This is between you and me, Morgana laughed. No. This stopped being between us the moment you let her become important to you. She's the leverage that makes you controllable. The vulnerability that transforms the fearsome Duke of Blackmere into just another man who'll surrender everything to protect what he loves. The word love hung in the air like accusation and truth combined, because that's what this was. Not strategic attachment, not useful alliance. Actual love that had somehow grown between a ruthless duke and a hostage who'd refused to see him as just a monster. And now that love was the weapon destroying them both. Seraphina struggled against restraints. Kaedric, listen to me. You can still get out of this. Leave me and save yourself. Don't let caring about me destroy everything you are. Her voice carried desperate urgency but also acceptance. She understood she was probably going to die here, was trying to give him permission to survive by abandoning her. It was exactly what the strategic part of his mind insisted was necessary. Cut losses, survive, rebuild power after this catastrophe. But the rest of him, the part that had started feeling human again, refused completely. I'm not leaving without you. Then you're both dying. Morgana's voice went cold. Because I don't need either of you alive. I just need you dead and blamed appropriately so I can take control of the Northern Territories without opposition. She gestured to the guards. Kill them both. Make it look like the Duke went insane and murdered his hostage before being stopped by loyal soldiers protecting Blackmere from his madness. The crossbows shifted aim toward killing shots. Time compressed into crystalline clarity where every detail became impossibly sharp, the guard's fingers tightening on triggers. Seraphina's eyes meeting his with complicated emotion that held no blame despite him bringing her to this. His own heartbeat thundering in his ears while his mind calculated impossible odds of surviving the next 3 seconds. He wasn't going to survive, but maybe he could buy Seraphina a few more moments. Maybe his death would make Morgana hesitate long enough for something, anything, to change the equation. It wasn't strategy. It was just the last desperate act of a man who'd finally learned that caring about someone meant being willing to die so they might live. Kaedric tensed to throw himself at the guards, when the chamber door exploded inward with violence that sent splinters flying like shrapnel. Marcus crashed through, followed by 20 armed men wearing the Duke's personal colors. Not Morgana's soldiers. Not corrupted members of the General Guard. The elite unit that had served Kaedric since before his father's death and remained loyal through every political nightmare. His steward's sword was already moving, cutting down the guard holding Seraphina before the man could process what was happening. Blood sprayed across stone walls while the other guards spun toward this new threat with weapons raised. The chamber erupted into chaos. Crossbow bolts fired wild as Kaedric's men crashed into Morgana's forces with overwhelming violence. Steel rang against steel. Men screamed and died. The close quarters made archery useless and turned everything into brutal melee, where loyalty and training mattered more than numbers. Kaedric didn't waste the opening. He dove for the fallen guard's sword and came up swinging toward the nearest threat. Blade caught flesh and bone and the guard went down spraying blood while Kaedric was already moving toward Seraphina. She was struggling with the restraints, hands working at knots while bodies fell around her. Kaedric reached her side and cut through the bindings with quick strokes that freed her completely. Can you move? Yes. She stood on shaking legs, but her eyes were clear and furious. Where did Marcus come from? Kaedric hauled her behind him while his men systematically destroyed Morgana's guards with the brutal efficiency of soldiers who'd trained together for years. I sent him a signal, hidden dead drop. We established years ago for exactly this kind of emergency. It had been a desperate gamble, a message scratched into stone where only Marcus would think to check if the Duke was imprisoned. 3 words that communicated everything: betrayal, mobilize, now. And his steward had understood immediately and done exactly what 15 years of loyal service had prepared him for. Gathered the men who'd never stopped fearing and respecting their Duke, and brought overwhelming force to where it was needed most. The fighting ended quickly. Morgana's guards were skilled but outnumbered against opponents who'd been training under the most ruthless military commander in the kingdom. Within 2 minutes, all of them were dead or dying, and Kaedric's men controlled the chamber completely, except for Morgana herself. She stood with her back against the far wall, dagger in hand, expression showing recognition that her perfect plan had just collapsed catastrophically. Kaedric crossed the blood-slicked floor with sword ready and murder in his eyes. Every step communicated exactly what was about to happen to the woman who'd orchestrated this betrayal. Marcus appeared at his side, breathing hard from exertion. My lord, Lord Theron and his co-conspirators are secured in the Great Hall. The fortress is back under your control. Your orders? Kaedric kept his eyes locked on Morgana while his mind calculated with cold precision. How many total conspirators? 17, including Lady Morgana. All key positions. They'd planned to control everything within hours of your execution. The scope of the betrayal was devastating. Not just Morgana. Nearly 20% of his inner circle had been working to remove him the moment he'd shown vulnerability by caring about someone. It was exactly the kind of coordinated coup that succeeded when rulers got soft. Except Kaedric hadn't gotten soft. He'd gotten desperate. And desperate men who understood violence as fundamental language could accomplish impossible things when survival demanded it. Gather all conspirators in the courtyard. Public execution at noon. I want every person in Blackmere to watch what happens to those who betray their Duke. Marcus hesitated. My lord, that's 17 people. The bloodshed will be significant. Perhaps trials. No trials. No delays. They conspired to murder me and Lady Seraphina. They planned to seize control through treachery and deception. The punishment is immediate and absolute. His voice carried the kind of cold finality that made even loyal men flinch. This was Duke Kaedric Raventhal at his most ruthless. The monster who'd built power through public demonstrations that made future betrayal too terrifying to consider. Seraphina's hand touched his arm. Kaedric. He didn't look at her. Couldn't look at her right now because seeing her face might make him hesitate, and hesitation would be interpreted as continued weakness. Not now. Those 2 words communicated everything, that he needed to be the monster completely before he could be the man again. That mercy right now would invite more challenges. That 17 public executions were necessary to remind everyone why the Duke of Blackmere was feared. Marcus nodded and began organizing his men to transport prisoners, while Kaedric finally turned his attention to Morgana. She stood defiant despite knowing exactly what came next. You're proving my point, Duke Raventhal. All this violence, all this brutality. You're the monster everyone fears, and now you're going to slaughter 17 people to maintain power built on terror. Yes. Her expression shifted to something like disappointment. And you think that makes you strong? That killing everyone who challenges you proves your authority? Kaedric closed the distance between them until his blade rested against her throat, with just enough pressure to draw blood. I think it keeps me alive. I think it protects people I care about from those who'd use my humanity as weapon against me. I think 17 dead conspirators teaches a lesson that prevents 1,700 future betrayals. His voice dropped lower. Something dangerous. You wanted me to be the monster, Lady Morgana. Counted on me being too human to do what survival demands. But you forgot the fundamental truth about men like me. We became monsters because good men die while monsters survive. And I'm very good at surviving. He should kill her now. Quick blade across the throat. Justice delivered before witnesses. But something made him pause and lean closer so only she could hear. Know this before you die. I'm executing you and your conspirators not because you challenged my power, but because you threatened her. And I've discovered that protecting what I love matters more than any amount of blood required to do it. Understanding flashed across Morgana's face. Recognition that she'd miscalculated fundamentally. Believed caring made him weak when it actually made him more dangerous than he'd ever been as a man with nothing to lose except power. Then Kadric stepped back and addressed his men. Take her with the others. She dies last. I want her to watch every execution and understand exactly what her conspiracy cost. Guards dragged Morgana away while she screamed defiance that echoed off stone walls and meant absolutely nothing. Alone again with Seraphina, Kadric finally let his sword drop and turned to face her properly. She stood covered in blood that wasn't hers, dress torn, bruises forming on her arms, looking at him with an expression that held too many emotions to parse individually. You came for me. Her voice was quiet but steady. Not quite a question. More like confirmation of something she'd needed to believe was true. Of course I did, even though it meant becoming the monster again, even though it required you to embrace the violence you'd been trying to move beyond. Seraphina moved closer until she stood directly in front of him, close enough that he could see her pulse beating in her throat where the blade had drawn blood, close enough that the warmth of her presence cut through the cold that had settled into his bones during the night in his cell. Yes, because keeping you alive matters more than who I have to become to accomplish it. The admission was raw and honest, complete abandonment of strategic distance in favor of truth that felt dangerous to articulate. Seraphina's hand came up to touch his face, fingers gentle against the blood and grime coating his skin. I heard what you told Morgana, about protecting what you love. Kadric's throat tightened. I meant it. I know. That's what terrifies me. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. Because loving you means watching you become the thing everyone fears. Means knowing that my presence in your life makes you more brutal instead of less. I'm the reason you're about to execute 17 people in your courtyard. No. Kadric caught her hand and held it against his face. Their betrayal is the reason. Their choice to see my caring as exploitable weakness. You're the reason I survived long enough to make them pay for that mistake. But at what cost? How much of your humanity do you sacrifice every time you choose violence to protect me? The question cut deep because it articulated exactly what Kadric had been wrestling with since the moment he'd understood the only way to save her was to become fully the monster again, as much as necessary. And I'll keep sacrificing it for as long as it takes to keep you alive and safe. Even if eventually there's nothing left except the Duke everyone fears, even if the man I chose disappears completely behind the reputation. Kadric pulled her close with desperate intensity. Then you remind me he still exists. You look at me like you are right now, and I remember I'm more than just violence and calculation. That somewhere underneath all the brutality required for survival, there's still someone worth caring about. Seraphina pressed against him, and he could feel her shaking slightly from accumulated trauma and exhaustion. I don't want to be the reason you lose yourself. You're the reason I found myself. Everything else is just the price of keeping what matters. They stood like that while the chamber emptied around them, and morning light filtered through high windows, and the weight of 17 pending executions pressed down like physical force. Eventually, Marcus returned. My lord. Prisoners secured. Courtyard prepared. The fortress has been notified of mandatory attendance at noon. Kadric nodded without releasing Seraphina. She'll need fresh clothes and medical attention for her injuries. Already arranged, my lord. And if I may say, I'm relieved you're both alive. When I found your message, I feared the worst. You did well, Marcus. Your loyalty will be rewarded. The steward hesitated. My lord, about the executions. 17 is significant. The blood will be considerable. Are you certain this is necessary? It was a fair question. Even loyal advisors questioned whether mass execution was the right response, whether mercy might accomplish more than terror. But Kadric had learned 15 years ago that mercy was interpreted as weakness by people constantly searching for vulnerabilities to exploit. That ruling through fear was more reliable than ruling through love, because fear could be manufactured while love required trust, and trust got you killed. This morning's events had simply confirmed that lesson with devastating clarity. Completely certain, they conspired to murder their duke and seize power through treachery. The punishment must be absolute enough that no one ever considers attempting it again. His voice carried the cold finality of a man who'd made his decision and wouldn't be moved by arguments about humanity or proportion. Marcus bowed and left to execute preparations while Seraphina pulled back enough to look at Kadric's face. There's no changing your mind about this? No. even though it means becoming exactly what your enemies claim you are. A brutal tyrant who rules through terror and slaughters anyone who challenges him. Yes, because being that tyrant keeps us both alive. And I've learned that surviving together is worth any amount of blood or reputation damage required to accomplish it. He cupped her face with hands still sticky with blood from the guards he'd killed. I know what I am, Serafina. Know what I'll always be when circumstances demand it. The question is whether you can live with loving a man capable of executing 17 people before breakfast without hesitation. Her eyes searched his face, and he could see her processing everything. The violence, the brutality, the absolute ruthlessness required to survive in environments built on power and fear. This was the moment she'd decide whether the monster was too much to accept, whether caring about him was worth watching him become something that terrified everyone else. I don't know if I can live with it, but I know I can't live without you. So I guess we figure out together how to balance the Duke everyone fears with the man I chose. The words settled something in Kaedric's chest. Not absolution. Not permission to embrace brutality without consequence. Just acknowledgement that they were both damaged and complicated and choosing each other anyway, despite knowing it would probably destroy them eventually. It was honest. Real. The kind of connection built on truth instead of illusions. And it was enough. Kaedric kissed her hard and desperate, like a man trying to prove something or anchor himself to something human before doing what came next. She responded with equal intensity, her hands fisting in his blood-soaked shirt while they clung to each other in a torture chamber surrounded by corpses. Eventually, they broke apart, and Kaedric rested his forehead against hers while trying to steady breathing that had gone ragged. You should rest before noon. The executions will be difficult to watch. I'm watching. If you have to do this, I'm standing beside you, not hiding in my quarters while you become the monster alone. The statement was fierce and certain. Partnership instead of judgment. Presence instead of abandonment. It meant more than Kaedric could articulate in words that wouldn't sound pathetic coming from a man about to slaughter 17 people. So he just nodded and led her from the chamber while his mind calculated exactly how the executions needed to be staged for maximum impact. Psychological warfare designed to prevent future betrayal through demonstrations so brutal that even thinking about conspiracy would make men lose sleep. This was who Duke Kaedric Raventhal actually was. And Serafina had just chosen to stand beside him anyway. The courtyard filled before noon with mandatory attendance that brought every person in Blackmere Keep to witness what happened to traitors. Servants, guards, merchants, minor nobles. Everyone crowded into the space while heavy clouds gathered overhead and wind carried the bite of coming storms. Kaedric stood on the raised platform where executions happened, wearing fresh clothes that communicated authority and carrying a sword that would personally deliver each death. Beside him stood Serafina in a dark dress that covered her injuries, her presence a statement that they were united despite conspiracy designed to drive them apart. The 17 conspirators were brought forward bound and stripped to the waist. Theron, Morgana, 15 others whose names Kaedric had memorized along with their specific crimes. They'd all participated in the coup, all believed they could remove him through coordinated treachery. Now they would die understanding exactly how catastrophically they'd miscalculated. Marcus read the charges in a voice that carried across the courtyard. Conspiracy against the Duke. Attempted murder. Treason against the Northern Territories. Each accusation followed by specific evidence that left no doubt about guilt. The assembled crowd listened in absolute silence. This wasn't entertainment. This was education through terror. A lesson about what happened when you betrayed the most ruthless lord in the kingdom. When Marcus finished, Kaedric addressed the courtyard directly. I built my rule on 2 principles: competence and loyalty. Those who serve well are rewarded. Those who betray are destroyed. These 17 forgot that lesson. All believed that showing human emotion made me vulnerable to manipulation. They were wrong. His voice carried cold certainty that made even innocent observers flinch. Let this serve as reminder to everyone present. I am Duke Kaedric Raventhal. My authority over the Northern Territories is absolute. Challenge it, and you die. Betray it, and you die slowly. Serve it faithfully, and you prosper under protection that makes you untouchable to external threats. He raised his sword. Watch carefully what happens next. Remember it when you sleep tonight and every night after. And understand that this is mercy compared to what I'm capable of when truly provoked. Then he began. The first execution was Lord Theron, who'd orchestrated the initial arrest. Kaedric forced him to kneel, placed the blade against his neck, and spoke quietly enough that only the condemned man could hear. "You were loyal for 10 years. That's the only reason I'm making this quick." Then he pulled the blade across Theron's throat with practiced efficiency. Blood sprayed across stone while the body collapsed and the crowd gasped at the casual brutality of their duke personally executing his military commander. Kedrick moved to the next conspirator without pausing. And the next. And the next. Each execution performed with cold precision that communicated this wasn't anger or rage. This was calculated demonstration of absolute power and willingness to use it without hesitation or remorse. Serafina stood watching with expression carefully neutral despite what this must be costing her. Every death a reminder that the man she'd chosen was capable of extraordinary violence when survival demanded it. Every spray of blood confirming that loving Duke Caedric Raventhal meant accepting all of what he was, including the parts that made him terrifying. But she didn't look away. Didn't retreat to safety where she could pretend not to know what he became when circumstances required the monster to emerge completely. She witnessed it all and stayed standing beside him. 15 conspirators died in steady progression. Quick deaths because Caedric wasn't sadist enjoying suffering. Just pragmatist understanding that public execution needed to be brutal enough to teach lessons without being so grotesque that it turned the crowd against him. It was calculated violence, measured brutality, everything he'd learned about maintaining power through fear instead of love. Finally, only Morgana remained. She was forced to her knees beside the bodies of her co-conspirators while blood pooled across stone and the smell of death hung thick in the air. Her expression showed defiance despite knowing exactly what came next. Caedric stood before her with sword ready and addressed the crowd once more. This woman orchestrated the conspiracy, planned my execution and Lady Serafina's, believed she could seize power through treachery and manipulation. She dies last so she could understand the full cost of her ambition. He looked down at Morgana with eyes that held no mercy. Any final words? Morgana met his gaze with bitter recognition. You've proven your point, Duke Raventhal. You're the monster everyone fears, capable of slaughtering 17 people without hesitation. I misjudged how completely you'd embrace what you are. Caedric's lip curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. No. You misjudged why I embrace it. I don't kill you because I enjoy power. I kill you because you threatened what I love. And I've discovered that protecting her matters more than any amount of blood required to accomplish it. Understanding flashed across Morgana's face one final time. Then Caedric's blade fell, and she died like all the others. The courtyard stood in absolute silence while 17 corpses bled out on stone and Duke Caedric Raventhal cleaned his sword with mechanical precision. Finally he spoke, voice carrying to every corner of the space. Return to your duties. Remember what you've witnessed here. And understand that loyalty to me and mine is the only thing that matters in Blackmere Keep. Everything else is negotiable. The crowd dispersed quickly, no one wanting to linger near the platform where their duke had just reminded everyone exactly why he'd maintained absolute power for 15 years. Eventually, only Caedric and Serafina remained beside the bodies, while guards began cleanup operations, and storm clouds finally opened to rain that washed blood from stone. Serafina's hand found his and squeezed once. Are you all right? Caedric looked at the carnage he'd created and felt nothing except tired satisfaction that immediate threats had been neutralized. The executions hadn't bothered him. Violence never did when it served necessary purpose. What bothered him was wondering how much of his humanity he'd just sacrificed. Whether the man Serafina had chosen still existed underneath the monster who'd killed 17 people without hesitation. Whether he'd finally crossed the line where Duke Caedric Raventhal became only reputation and terror with nothing real beneath. But then Serafina was there, squeezing his hand and reminding him through simple touch that someone still saw past the blood to whatever remained underneath. And that had to be enough. I will be. Eventually, they stood together in the rain watching water wash away evidence of the morning's brutality while the fortress around them settled back into its familiar rhythms. But Caedric knew this wasn't over. Morgana had mentioned working with the crown. Intelligence from royal sources, which meant someone in the capital had been coordinating with her conspiracy. Someone powerful enough to sanction the Duke of Blackmere's removal. The summons he'd received before the coup was probably bait, trap designed to get him away from Blackmere where he could be eliminated quietly, which meant the real threat wasn't the conspirators he'd just executed. It was whoever had been pulling their strings from the capital, and that enemy was still out there, waiting, planning the next move in whatever game was being played with the Northern Territories as stakes. Kadric looked at Seraphina standing beside him, rain-soaked and exhausted but alive, and chose. They were coming for him anyway. The Crown or its agents or whoever wanted the North under different control. He could wait here defensively and let enemies choose the battlefield, or he could take the fight to them directly. He turned to Marcus, who'd approached with reports about fortress security. Prepare travel arrangements. We leave for the capital in 3 days. Full military escort. And send word ahead that Duke Kadric Raventhal is accepting the king's summons and bringing evidence of crown conspiracy against northern independence. His steward's eyes widened. My lord, that's extremely dangerous. If the crown was involved in the coup, arriving at the capital with accusations is exactly what they won't expect. They assumed I'd be dead or at least trapped here dealing with internal chaos. Instead, I'm bringing the fight directly to them with proof of their involvement. Kadric's voice hardened. And I'm bringing Seraphina because leaving her here makes her vulnerable to whatever they try next. We survive this together or not at all? Marcus nodded grimly and left to execute preparations while Seraphina stared at Kadric with mixture of concern and something that might have been awe. You're insane. Walking directly into the capital when the crown wants you dead is suicide. Probably. But waiting here while they plot the next attack is slow death. At least this way we force confrontation on terms we control. And if we die, then we die fighting instead of hiding. Together instead of separated. He pulled her close, despite the rain and the blood and the corpses still being cleared from the courtyard. I told you I'd protect you. That means eliminating every threat, including the ones powerful enough to orchestrate coups from distance. The king thinks he can remove me through proxies and political manipulation. Time to show him exactly what happens when you threaten the Duke of Blackmere directly. Seraphina pressed against him, and he could feel her heart racing. This is going to be catastrophic. Yes, we might not survive. Probably not. She pulled back to look at his face, and her eyes held fierce determination, despite the fear. Then we make them regret underestimating what we're willing to do to protect each other. Kadric smiled for the first time since escaping his cell, cold and predatory and absolutely genuine. Now you're thinking like someone who's survived the Duke of Blackmere long enough to become dangerous yourself. They turned together toward the fortress as rain intensified and storm clouds covered the sky completely. In 3 days, they would ride to the capital with enough armed force to start a war and evidence of conspiracy that would force the crown to either acknowledge involvement or eliminate them both to protect the truth. It was reckless, suicidal, everything strategic thinking argued against. But Duke Kadric Raventhal had spent 15 years being strategic, and it had left him empty and isolated and convinced caring was weakness. Now he'd found something worth protecting more than power. And he was about to teach every enemy who'd underestimated him a devastating lesson about what happened when monsters finally found something to love. The storm that had been gathering over Blackmere Keep finally broke completely, wind howling like something alive and desperate, while rain hammered the blood from stone. And inside, covered in the evidence of 17 executions, Duke Kadric Raventhal held Seraphina Vale close and prepared for the war that would determine whether caring about someone made you vulnerable, or whether it made you absolutely unstoppable. The road to the capital stretched like a scar across frozen landscape. 3 days of preparation had transformed into a military procession that made villagers scatter and merchants pull their wagons aside when they saw the Duke of Blackmere's banners approaching. 200 armed men, supply wagons carrying evidence of conspiracy. And at the center of it all, Duke Kadric Raventhal riding beside Seraphina Vale like they were heading toward coronation instead of potential execution. Kadric understood the optics. This looked like declaration of war. Armed force marching directly toward the capital with enough soldiers to challenge royal authority if things went badly. The king would interpret it as either desperation or aggression. Both assessments were accurate, because Kadric had learned something fundamental during those hours in his cell and the executions that followed. He was done playing defensive, done reacting to threats from position of isolated power that enemies could chip away through conspiracy and manipulation. If the crown wanted him dead or controlled, they'd have to face him directly instead of hiding behind proxies and political machinations. And he was bringing enough force to ensure that confrontation happened on terms he dictated. Seraphina rode beside him, wrapped in furs against the cold, her expression carrying the complicated exhaustion of someone who'd survived trauma and was still processing what it meant. She hadn't spoken much during the journey, just watched the landscape pass while her mind worked through everything that had happened since her father's death. Kadric gave her space, but stayed close enough that his presence communicated protection. He'd meant what he said about them surviving together or not at all. Whatever came next at the capital, they'd face it as unit rather than duke and hostage, performing roles that had stopped being accurate weeks ago. Marcus rode up alongside with reports about the route ahead. "My lord, scouts confirm the capital gates are aware of our approach. Royal Guard has been reinforced. They're expecting us, but unclear whether as guests or threats." Kadric's expression remained neutral. Probably both. The king won't know how to interpret armed force arriving with evidence of crown conspiracy. Fear and curiosity will compete until we force his hand with direct confrontation. And if he simply refuses us entry, orders the gates closed and demands we disperse, then we siege the capital until he agrees to see me. I didn't ride 3 days through winter to be turned away by nervous guards. The statement was casual but absolute. Kadric meant every word. He'd come to force reckoning with whoever had orchestrated the coup against him. Gate security wasn't going to prevent that. Marcus nodded grimly and fell back to relay orders while Serafina finally spoke. "You're really willing to start a war over this?" Not a question, just acknowledgement of how far he was prepared to go. "I'm willing to end one." Whoever's been pulling strings assumed I could be removed quietly through internal betrayal. Instead, I'm bringing the fight directly to them and forcing them to either acknowledge involvement or kill me publicly. Either outcome exposes the truth. And if they kill us both, then at least we die, making them reveal themselves instead of disappearing quietly into political machinations no one remembers a year later. He glanced at her and his expression softened slightly despite the cold calculation governing most of his decisions. "I know this isn't what you imagined when you chose to stay at Blackmere. The caring about me would lead directly to riding toward your possible execution, surrounded by soldiers and conspiracy." Serafina's lip curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I didn't imagine any of this. Being taken hostage, watching my father die, falling in love with the kingdom's most ruthless duke. But here we are anyway." The casual use of love made something tighten in Kadric's chest. She'd said it before, but always in context of defending him or explaining choices. Never just as simple acknowledgement of what existed between them. Here we are. He wanted to say more, articulate what she'd come to mean to him beyond strategic value or even personal attachment, how her presence had made isolation feel less like protection and more like slow death, how choosing her had been the first honest decision he'd made in 15 years. But words felt inadequate for the complexity of what he felt. And they were riding toward confrontation that might render sentiment irrelevant within hours. So instead he just reached across the space between their horses and squeezed her gloved hand once. Brief contact that communicated everything language couldn't. She squeezed back and they rode in silence while the capital's walls appeared on the horizon like judgment made stone. The gates didn't close. That was the first surprise. Royal guards watched their approach with obvious tension, but the massive doors remained open while Kadric's procession entered the capital's outer districts. Citizens lined the streets watching the Duke of Blackmere's banners pass with expressions mixing fear and curiosity. They knew his reputation, the ruthless northern lord who crushed opposition without mercy. But they'd also heard rumors about recent events, coup attempt, mass executions, something about a woman who'd somehow transformed the kingdom's most dangerous man into something unpredictable. The second surprise came when they reached the palace district. A royal messenger intercepted them with sealed orders bearing the king's personal insignia. "Duke Raventhal, His Majesty requests your immediate presence in the throne room. Private audience. You may bring Lady Serafina Vale and one advisor. Your military escort must remain outside palace grounds." Kadric read the summons while calculating implications. Private audience meant the king wanted control over narrative. Limiting attendees meant preventing witnesses to whatever happened next. It was strategic positioning by someone who understood power dynamics. But it was also acknowledgement that the Duke couldn't simply be turned away or arrested without confrontation. "Tell His Majesty I accept his generous invitation. Lady Serafina and my steward Marcus will accompany me. The rest of my men will await my return." The messenger departed while Kadric organized his forces. 200 soldiers positioned strategically around the palace district. Not siege formation exactly, but close enough that everyone understood what would happen if the Duke didn't emerge safely. Marcus appeared at his side, looking grim. My lord, this could be trap. Walking into the palace with minimal escort is exactly what political power requires. I can't force confrontation while hiding behind military strength. At some point, strategy requires personal risk. He turned to address his assembled commanders. If I'm not back by sunset, assume the worst. Storm the palace. Rescue Lady Seraphina if possible. And make sure every kingdom in the empire knows the crown murdered Duke Cadric Raventhal under flag of diplomatic negotiation. The orders were clear and absolute. His men nodded with grim understanding. They'd follow those commands because 15 years of leadership had built loyalty that transcended even fear of royal authority. Cadric turned to Seraphina, who'd been listening with carefully controlled expression. Ready? No, but I'm coming anyway. They dismounted and walked toward the palace entrance, flanked by royal guards who maintained professional distance while clearly prepared for violence if orders came. The palace interior was exactly as Cadric remembered from mandatory councils past. Marble halls, expensive tapestries, everything designed to communicate absolute power and unlimited resources. It was impressive if you cared about displays of wealth. Cadric had built his authority on fear and competence. Marble meant nothing compared to reputation for ruthless efficiency. The throne room doors opened and they were announced with formal ceremony that felt almost absurd given the circumstances. Duke Cadric Raventhal of the Northern Territories, Lady Seraphina Vale, Marcus Aldrin, steward of Blackmere Keep. The chamber beyond held maybe 30 people. King Edward sat on his throne looking older than Cadric remembered. Gray hair, lined face, the exhaustion of a man who'd ruled for 30 years and was tired of the constant machinations required to maintain power. Beside him stood Lord Chancellor Varick, a political creature who'd survived multiple regime changes through careful manipulation and strategic betrayals. He was watching Cadric with calculation that suggested involvement in whatever had brought them here. Around the room's perimeter stood various nobles and advisors whose faces communicated varying degrees of concern and curiosity about why the Northern Duke had arrived with an army. Cadric walked forward with Seraphina at his side until they stood before the throne at appropriate distance for formal audience. He didn't kneel, didn't bow deeply, just gave the minimal acknowledgement protocol required while maintaining eye contact that communicated he saw himself as near equal rather than subject. The king noticed. Everyone noticed. Edward leaned forward slightly, voice carrying weariness, and something that might have been genuine curiosity. Duke Raventhal, you arrive at our capital with considerable military force and evidence of conspiracy. Explain what brings you here in such dramatic fashion. The invitation was clear. State your case. Justify your presence. Make this diplomatic instead of hostile. Cadric's voice carried through the chamber with cold precision. Your Majesty, I come because elements within this court conspired with traitors in my household to orchestrate a coup designed to remove me from power and seize control of the Northern Territories. The conspiracy failed. 17 traitors died. But evidence recovered suggests coordination with royal sources. Murmurs spread through assembled nobles. This was direct accusation of crown involvement in treason, the kind of claim that could trigger civil war if not handled carefully. King Edward's expression didn't change. Serious allegations, Duke Raventhal. Do you have proof of this coordination? Cadric gestured to Marcus, who produced documents from the leather case he'd carried. Letters, financial records, testimony extracted from conspirators before execution, all pointing to Lord Chancellor Varick as primary contact between Blackmere's traitors and the capital. The Chancellor's face went pale, but he recovered quickly. Forgeries, Your Majesty. Obvious fabrications by a desperate man, trying to justify his brutal suppression of legitimate concerns about his judgment. Legitimate concerns? Cadric's voice dropped to something dangerous. You orchestrated assassination attempt against me and Lady Seraphina because I chose to protect her after her father's death. Because you saw human compassion as exploitable weakness. I saw compromised judgment, Varick countered. The Northern Territories cannot be governed by a duke whose personal attachments override strategic necessity. Your executions of 17 people prove exactly the kind of instability we were trying to prevent. The argument was elegant in its reversal. Use Cadric's response to betrayal as evidence that concerns about his judgment were justified. Make him the villain for defending himself. It would have worked if King Edward was predisposed to believe his chancellor over the Northern Duke. But the king was studying Caedric with expressions suggesting uncertainty rather than predetermined conclusion. Lord Chancellor, why was I not informed about concerns regarding Duke Raventhal's fitness to rule? The question landed like blade between ribs. Edward had just revealed he hadn't authorized the conspiracy, that Varick had acted independently. The Chancellor shifted uncomfortably. Your Majesty, I believe the situation required discreet handling to prevent northern instability from spreading throughout the kingdom. So you authorized removal of a territorial duke without royal approval? Orchestrated coup through proxy traitors? That sounds remarkably like treason against my authority. Understanding rippled through the chamber. This wasn't about whether Caedric was fit to rule. It was about whether the Lord Chancellor had exceeded his authority by attempting to remove a duke without royal sanction. The power dynamic had just shifted dramatically. Varick's expression hardened. With respect, Your Majesty, Duke Raventhal's judgment has been compromised by personal attachment to this woman. He keeps her at Blackmere without political justification, admits publicly to prioritizing her safety over strategic necessity. That represents vulnerability our enemies will exploit. He gestured toward Serafina with barely concealed disdain. She's the daughter of a known traitor. Her presence at Blackmere creates security risks that Duke Raventhal refuses to acknowledge because his feelings have overridden rational assessment. The accusation was direct and calculated. Force the king to choose between his chancellor's pragmatic concerns and the duke's emotional compromise. Caedric felt Serafina tense beside him, but she maintained composure. This was the moment that would determine everything, whether Edward saw caring as weakness or recognized it as something more complicated. The king stood slowly, and the room went silent. He walked down from his throne with measured steps until he stood directly before Caedric and Serafina. For a long moment, he studied them both. Then he spoke. Duke Raventhal, you're being accused of compromised judgment because you've chosen to protect a woman who no longer provides strategic value. Your chancellor believes this makes you vulnerable and unstable. Yes, Your Majesty. And your response? Caedric met the king's eyes without flinching. My response is that strategic value isn't the only metric that matters when governing territories full of actual human beings. Lady Serafina lost her father to political machinations beyond her control. Providing her sanctuary was a decent thing to do, regardless of tactical advantage. He paused, then continued with absolute conviction. But more than that, caring about her has made me better ruler. More aware of costs my decisions impose on people beyond military necessity. More willing to question whether power maintained through fear alone is worth the isolation it requires. Lord Chancellor sees this as weakness. I see it as evolution from monster everyone feared into leader. People might actually follow out of something other than terror. The confession was more honest than Caedric had intended. Complete abandonment of strategic posturing in favor of raw truth about what Serafina had made him want to become. The throne room held collective breath while King Edward processed this. Finally, he turned to Varick. Lord Chancellor, I appointed you to help me govern wisely, not to orchestrate removal of territorial dukes without royal approval. Your concerns about Duke Raventhal may have merit, but your methods represent exactly the kind of overreach that destabilizes kingdoms more effectively than any individual duke's personal choices. Varick's face went ashen. Your Majesty, I acted in the kingdom's best interests. You acted in presumption of authority you don't possess, and in doing so, you've created the exact crisis you claim to prevent. The king returned to his throne, and his next words carried finality. Lord Chancellor Varick, you are hereby removed from your position pending formal investigation into conspiracy against territorial authority. Duke Raventhal, your governance of the Northern Territories is confirmed with full royal support. No further interference will be tolerated from this court or any other. He gestured broadly. This audience is concluded. Duke Raventhal and Lady Serafina are guests of the crown for the next 3 days should they choose to remain in the capital, after which they're free to return north with my personal assurance that no further attempts against their authority or safety will be sanctioned. The pronouncement was clear and absolute. Caedric had won. Not through military force or political manipulation, through honest acknowledgement of what mattered to him and luck that the king valued truth over his chancellor's machinations. Varick was being escorted from the chamber by guards, while assembled nobles processed what had just happened. The most ruthless duke in the kingdom had admitted to prioritizing personal attachment over strategy and somehow emerged victorious. It would be talked about for years. But right now, standing in that throne room with Seraphina beside him and royal protection confirmed, all Kaedric felt was exhausted relief. They'd survived. Both of them, together. The king approached again, this time with expression that held something almost like understanding. Duke Raventhal, a word of advice from someone who's ruled longer than you've been alive. Power maintained only through fear is fragile because people are always searching for the moment you show weakness. But power built on combination of respect and genuine care for those you protect becomes remarkably difficult to overthrow. He glanced at Seraphina, then back to Kaedric. Your father understood that. Perhaps you're finally learning it yourself. Don't abandon the ruthlessness that's kept you alive, but temper it with the humanity that makes life worth living. That balance is what transforms good rulers into great ones. The words struck deeper than Edward probably intended because they articulated exactly what Kaedric had been wrestling with since Seraphina entered his life. How to remain dangerous enough to protect what mattered while not becoming so cold that nothing mattered at all. Thank you, Your Majesty. I'll remember that. They were dismissed with ceremony and walked from the throne room into corridor where Marcus was waiting with barely contained relief. My lord, that went considerably better than I anticipated. Kaedric almost smiled. Considerably better than I anticipated as well, though I suspect Lord Chancellor Varric's removal creates new problems we'll need to navigate. But problems for another day. Right now, he was focused on getting Seraphina somewhere private where they could finally process everything that had happened. The royal guest quarters were luxurious in ways Blackmere Keep had never aspired to. Silk bedding, ornate furniture, windows overlooking the capital with views designed to impress visiting dignitaries. It felt excessive after weeks of fortress living, but Seraphina seemed to appreciate the comfort after days of hard travel. She stood at the window watching the city below while Kaedric dismissed servants who'd been assigned to assist them. Once alone, he moved to stand beside her and they watched the capital's evening activity in silence. Finally, Seraphina spoke. You told the king the truth about caring about me making you better instead of weaker. Yes. That took courage. I didn't think you had. Admitting vulnerability to the kingdom's highest authority while your enemies were actively trying to destroy you. Kaedric considered that. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just tired of pretending to be invulnerable when you've already seen through every defense I've built over 15 years. He turned to face her properly and found her watching him with expression that held complicated emotion. I meant what I said. You've made me better. More aware of humanity I'd buried under survival instinct and strategic calculation. More willing to risk vulnerability for connection that actually matters. I don't know if that makes me weaker or stronger in practical terms, but I know it makes me feel less hollow than I have since my father died. Seraphina's eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. You're not hollow, Kaedric. You're just someone who's been surviving so long that you forgot how to live. And watching you remember has been both beautiful and terrifying because I know how much it costs you. She moved closer until they stood almost touching. But I need you to understand something. I didn't fall in love with the Duke everyone fears. I fell in love with the man who admitted he was afraid caring would destroy him, but chose to care anyway. That courage matters more to me than any amount of ruthless efficiency. The words settled into Kaedric's chest with weight that felt simultaneously crushing and liberating. Because Seraphina had just articulated exactly what he'd needed to hear. That being human wasn't weakness. That vulnerability could coexist with strength, that the man and the monster weren't mutually exclusive if he could find balance between them. I don't know how to be both, the ruthless Duke and the man capable of caring without calculation. Then we figure it out together. You teach me how to survive in worlds built on power. I remind you why survival is worth the effort. We become something neither of us could be alone. Partnership instead of possession. Growth instead of control. It was everything Kaedric had thought impossible when he first saw Seraphina enter his fortress wearing crimson like deliberate provocation. Now it felt like the only thing that made sense. He pulled her close and kissed her with desperate intensity that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with finally admitting he needed someone more than he needed control. She responded with equal fervor, her hands fisting in his shirt, while they clung to each other in expensive guest quarters that felt less like shelter and more like victory against impossible odds. When they finally broke apart, Kaedric rested his forehead against hers while trying to steady breathing that had gone ragged. Stay with me. Not as hostage or political arrangement, As partner who chooses me despite knowing exactly what I'm capable of becoming when circumstances demand it. Serafina's smile was small and tired, but genuine. I already chose you, multiple times. In torture chambers and throne rooms, and every moment between when leaving would have been smarter, but staying felt necessary. Her expression grew serious. But I need something from you in return. Promise me you'll keep trying to be more than just the monster. That you won't use my presence as excuse to justify brutality without questioning whether violence is actually necessary or just comfortable habit. The request was fair and challenging. She wanted him to maintain the growth he'd started instead of using their connection as justification for staying exactly as he'd been. It meant holding himself accountable to standards beyond simple survival. It meant questioning his own instincts and calculations instead of just trusting 15 years of experience. It was uncomfortable, difficult. Everything his trauma-forged personality resisted. But looking at Serafina's face and understanding what she was offering, partnership built on mutual growth instead of one person changing to fit the other's needs, Kaedric found himself nodding. I promise. I'll keep questioning whether the Duke everyone fears is the only thing I can be. And you keep reminding me when I'm defaulting to ruthlessness out of habit instead of necessity. Deal. They sealed it with another kiss that felt like beginning instead of ending. The next 3 days passed in strange suspension. Kaedric met with various nobles who wanted to understand the Northern Duke's intentions after his dramatic arrival. Serafina navigated court politics with surprising skill, deflecting invasive questions about her relationship with Kaedric while gathering intelligence about potential threats. Together they attended royal dinners where the king made public display of supporting the Northern Territories and their duke's authority. It was political theater designed to prevent further challenges to Kaedric's rule by demonstrating crown approval. But beneath the diplomatic performance, something more fundamental was shifting. Other nobles were watching how Duke Kaedric Raventhal interacted with Lady Serafina. Seeing the ruthless lord everyone feared softened slightly when she spoke, witnessing moments of humanity that contradicted his reputation for cold calculation. Some interpreted it as weakness, but others, particularly those tired of ruling through fear alone, saw it as possibility. That strength and compassion weren't mutually exclusive. That acknowledging you cared about something beyond power didn't automatically make you vulnerable to destruction. It was a radical concept in environments built on strategic relationships and political calculation. And Duke Kaedric Raventhal was becoming its most unexpected advocate simply by existing honestly instead of performing invulnerability. On their last evening in the capital, King Edward requested private dinner with Kaedric and Serafina. No advisors, no witnesses, just 3 people discussing matters that required discretion. They met in the king's personal chambers rather than formal dining halls. Edward looked tired but more relaxed than during their throne room confrontation. Over wine and surprisingly simple food, he spoke candidly. I envy you both, the freedom to acknowledge what you actually feel without layers of political calculation complicating everything. Kaedric raised an eyebrow. Your Majesty, I've spent the past 3 months learning that acknowledging feelings creates considerably more complications than suppressing them. Edward smiled slightly. True, but complications born from honesty are manageable. Complications from hiding who you are become increasingly catastrophic over time. Trust me on this. He took a long drink of wine. I was married once, before becoming king, loved her genuinely. But when I inherited the throne, advisors convinced me emotional attachment was liability. So I suppressed it, treated her as political partner instead of wife. She died thinking I'd never actually cared. The confession carried weight of decades-old regret. I've spent 30 years ruling efficiently and alone, built powerful kingdom, maintained stability through careful calculation. But I'd trade considerable amount of that success for one honest conversation with the woman I pretended not to love because advisors said love made rulers weak. He looked at Kaedric directly. Don't make my mistake. You found something rare. Someone who sees past your reputation to actual person underneath. That's worth protecting even if it creates vulnerabilities your enemies will try to exploit. Because living only for power eventually makes you question why you're bothering to survive at all. The words resonated with uncomfortable accuracy because they described exactly where Kaedric had been before Serafina disrupted his carefully controlled existence. Thank you, Your Majesty. That's wisdom I'll remember. They talked late into evening about rule and power and the costs of maintaining both. By the time they left, Kaedric understood something fundamental about King Edward. He was a lonely man who'd chosen power over connection and spent 3 decades regretting it. It was warning and lesson combined. Walking back to their quarters through empty palace corridors, Serafina squeezed his hand. You heard what he said about regret. Yes, don't let us become that. Don't let fear of vulnerability push you back into isolation that feels safe but slowly kills everything human about you. Kaedric stopped and pulled her close in the middle of the corridor. I won't. I can't. You've made it impossible for me to go back to being only the monster. Even when circumstances require ruthlessness, you'll be there reminding me why it matters that I question whether violence is actually necessary. Promise? Promise. They returned north the next morning with royal escort and formal documents confirming Kaedric's authority. The journey back felt different than the tense march to the capital. Less desperate. More like returning home after surviving ordeal that had tested everything they'd built together. Marcus rode alongside for part of the trip, expression carrying relief mixed with exhaustion. My lord, if I may say, that was a remarkably stressful experience that I hope never to repeat. Kaedric almost smiled. Agreed. Though it accomplished what needed accomplishing. Crown support confirmed. Conspirators eliminated or removed from power. Northern territories secured. And Lady Serafina's position? The steward's question was carefully neutral, but carried genuine concern. Marcus had watched their relationship develop and understood the complications it created. Lady Serafina stays. Not as hostage or political arrangement, as partner who shares authority over Blackmere and the Northern Territories. I'll formalize it when we return home. Marcus nodded with approval. The people will appreciate that clarity. And frankly, my lord, she's been good for you. You're still terrifying when necessary, but marginally less likely to execute people for minor infractions. Kaedric laughed, actual genuine laugh that surprised both of them. Is that Marcus's diplomatic way of saying, I've become less of a monster? That's Marcus's honest assessment that you've become more effective leader by balancing ruthlessness with occasional humanity. Monsters are feared. Leaders are followed. You're finally becoming the latter. The observation settled uncomfortably because it meant others had noticed the changes Kaedric was still processing internally. But Marcus's tone suggested approval rather than concern. Maybe that was progress. They reached Blackmere Keep as sun was setting over the northern cliffs. The fortress looked exactly as they'd left it, dark stone against darker sky, waves crashing below with violence that never quieted. But approaching it now felt different than every other return over 15 years. Because Kaedric wasn't coming back to isolation anymore. He was coming home with someone who'd chosen to share that space. The Great Hall filled that evening for dinner celebrating the Duke's return. His people, soldiers, advisors, servants who'd survived recent chaos, gathered to hear about what had happened in the capital. Kaedric stood before them and told simplified version of events. Crown conspiracy exposed, authority confirmed. Northern territories secured for foreseeable future. He left out most of the emotional complexity and focused on practical outcomes that mattered for their security. But then he did something unexpected. He called Serafina to stand beside him. Many of you know Lady Serafina Vale arrived here as hostage months ago. Her father's treason made her valuable leverage that I used without hesitation. But circumstances changed. She changed. I changed. He looked at her and found her watching him with expression that held complicated emotion. She's no longer hostage or political tool. She's partner who shares authority over Blackmere and our territories. Someone who's earned that position by surviving everything recent weeks threw at us and making me better ruler in the process. Murmurs spread through the hall, but Kaedric continued over them. I know this seems unusual. The Duke everyone fears publicly acknowledging personal attachment and sharing power. Some will see it as weakness. Let them. I've learned that strength isn't measured only by isolation and ruthlessness. Real power includes knowing when to trust others and when vulnerability serves better than invulnerability. He paused, letting that settle. So understand this. Lady Serafina has my complete support and protection. Disrespecting her means disrespecting me. And we all know what happens to people who disrespect the Duke of Blackmere. The threat was clear but delivered with slight smile that took some edge off. People laughed nervously and the tension broke into something approaching approval. They might not fully understand his relationship with Serafina, but they understood authority when they saw it. And the Duke had just made his position unmistakably clear. Later, alone in his study, Kedrick stood at the window watching storm clouds gather over the northern sea. Serafina joined him, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind and resting her head against his back. That was quite a speech. It was necessary. Establishing your authority prevents future challenges based on our relationship. Also, publicly acknowledging you care about me in front of everyone who spent years fearing you. That took courage. Kedrick turned in her embrace and pulled her close. Or maybe I've finally learned that caring doesn't make me weak. Just makes me have something worth protecting beyond power for its own sake. They stood like that while wind howled outside and fire crackled in the hearth, and the weight of everything they'd survived together settled into something approaching peace. It wouldn't last forever. There would be new threats, new challenges. The political landscape they inhabited didn't allow for permanent safety. But right now, holding Serafina in his study while storm gathered outside, Duke Kedrick Raventhal felt something he hadn't experienced since before his father's death. Hope that tomorrow might be better than today. Trust that vulnerability didn't automatically equal destruction. Understanding that the monster and the man could coexist if he kept questioning which one's circumstances actually required. He'd spent 15 years surviving by becoming something everyone feared. Now he was learning to live by becoming someone capable of growth beyond survival. It was harder, more complicated, required constant effort to balance ruthlessness with humanity instead of defaulting to cold calculation. But looking at Serafina's face and feeling her warmth against him while winter raged outside, Kedrick understood something fundamental. Living was always harder than surviving, but it was also the only thing that made survival worth the cost. Months passed. Spring arrived slowly at Blackmere Keep, melting snow and revealing landscape that had been buried under winter's brutality. The fortress remained exactly as harsh and imposing as ever, but inside, something had shifted in ways that people noticed but couldn't quite articulate. The Duke was still ruthless when necessary, still made hard decisions without hesitation, still maintained iron control over northern territories through combination of fear and competence. But he laughed occasionally now, smiled at private jokes, walked through corridors with Serafina discussing matters that had nothing to do with strategy or military planning. He'd become simultaneously more and less approachable, more human but no less dangerous. It was a combination that kept people off balance in ways that served him well. One evening, as sun set over the cliffs and Kedrick worked through reports in his study, Serafina entered carrying something wrapped in cloth. She set it on his desk with expression mixing nervousness and determination. "What's this?" "Open it." Kedrick unwrapped the cloth to reveal a painting, small, intimate, depicting scene he recognized immediately despite having tried to forget it for 15 years. A castle courtyard at dawn. A man being executed while a boy screamed from a tower window. His father's death. But the painting didn't stop there. It showed the same courtyard years later. Empty, snow-covered, and a single figure standing where the execution had happened, head bowed, clearly remembering. Him, visiting the place where his father died and finally allowing himself to grieve instead of just calculating revenge. "Where did you get this?" "I painted it. Based on things you've told me about that night and what it cost you. I thought maybe you needed to see it rendered as memory that acknowledges pain instead of just fuel for survival." Kedrick stared at the painting while his throat tightened dangerously. No one had ever acknowledged his father's death as trauma instead of just origin story for the monster he'd become. Serafina had somehow captured the grief he'd never allowed himself to process beneath the rage and fear. It was devastatingly accurate representation of what he'd buried for 15 years. Why? His voice came out rougher than intended. Serafina moved around the desk and crouched beside his chair. "Because you're allowed to still grieve him, even after becoming everything you did to survive his loss. The Duke of Blackmere and the 12-year-old who lost his father can coexist if you let them." Her hand found his and squeezed gently. "You taught me that strength includes vulnerability. That surviving doesn't mean suppressing every emotion except cold calculation. I'm just returning the lesson." Kedrick looked at the painting and felt something crack inside his chest that had been frozen solid since that night in the courtyard. Not breaking, thawing. Finally allowing himself to acknowledge the pain instead of just weaponizing it, he pulled Serafina into his lap and held her while looking at the image of his younger self standing in snow-covered courtyard, finally permitting grief. "Thank you." Two words that barely scratched surface of what he felt. But Serafina seemed to understand anyway, because she just nodded and stayed close while he processed emotions he'd forbidden himself from feeling for half his lifetime. They sat like that until darkness fell completely and the painting became just shapes in firelight. But something had shifted. Some final piece of armor had been removed not through force, but through trust that vulnerability wouldn't destroy him. That night, for the first time since his father's death, Duke Cadric Raventhal slept without nightmares. Years later, when historians wrote about the Northern Territories during this period, they would note marked changes in Duke Raventhal's governance. Still ruthless, still efficient, but tempered with understanding that effective rule required balance between fear and genuine concern for people being governed. They would mention Lady Seraphina's influence without fully understanding how a hostage had transformed the kingdom's most dangerous man into something approaching an actual leader instead of just a monster everyone feared. They would document reduced executions, increased prosperity, stable northern territories that no longer existed in constant tension between absolute control and brewing rebellion. What they wouldn't document, because it happened privately in a fortress where observers were rarely permitted, was the slow transformation of a man learning to live instead of just survive. Duke Cadric Raventhal never stopped being dangerous, never lost the capacity for ruthless violence when circumstances demanded it. The monster everyone feared remained very real beneath whatever humanity he'd reclaimed. But he'd learned to question whether every situation actually required the monster, whether his first instinct toward brutal efficiency was always correct or sometimes just comfortable habit. And he had Seraphina there to remind him when he was defaulting to violence instead of genuinely calculating necessity. It wasn't perfect. They argued, disagreed about decisions, pushed each other toward growth that neither found comfortable. But it was real, honest, built on foundation of two damaged people choosing connection despite every strategic reason that seemed catastrophically risky. And somehow, against impossible odds, it worked. On cold winter evening, 10 years after everything that brought them together, Cadric stood at his study window watching his children, twins, boy and girl, playing in the courtyard below. Their mother watched nearby, expression carrying complicated mix of joy and vigilance that came from surviving the kind of trauma that never fully released its grip. Marcus entered with evening reports and paused at the scene. "Your family seems well, my lord." "Yes, though I wonder sometimes what it means that I've brought children into a world as harsh as the one that shaped me." The steward moved to stand beside him at the window. "Perhaps it means you're committed to making that world marginally less harsh than it was. Your children won't grow up watching their father die, won't learn that caring equals destruction. That's legacy worth building." Cadric considered that. Maybe. Though they'll still grow up as Duke's children, that brings its own complications. All positions of power bring complications. But at least yours will know their father loved them enough to question whether ruthlessness was always necessary. That matters more than you realize. After Marcus left, Seraphina appeared with her usual timing that suggested she'd been waiting for privacy. She wrapped her arms around him from behind, and they watched their children together while wind howled outside and fire crackled behind them. "Any regrets?" "About all of it?" Cadric pulled her around to face him properly. "Hundreds. But none about choosing you. None about learning that vulnerability isn't always weakness. None about discovering that surviving is meaningless if you're not actually living." He kissed her forehead gently. "You saved me, you know, not from enemies or political threats. From becoming so hollow that power was the only thing that mattered. From spending my entire life as the monster my trauma created without ever remembering I was human underneath." Seraphina smiled. "You saved yourself. I just reminded you it was possible." They stood together watching the fortress that had witnessed their transformation from captor and hostage into something neither had imagined possible. And Duke Cadric Raventhal understood with absolute certainty that 15 years of building power through fear had given him control over territories and people. But learning to love someone more than survival had given him something far more valuable. A life worth living instead of just enduring. Purpose beyond maintaining power for its own sake. Legacy built on growth instead of just ruthless efficiency. The storm that had shaped him would always be part of who he was. The 12-year-old who watched his father die would never fully disappear beneath the Duke everyone feared. But he'd learned to carry that pain without letting it consume everything human about him. And that made all the difference between existing as monster and living as man, capable of both strength and compassion. The Northern Territories would always remember Duke Cadric Raventhal as their most ruthless ruler, but history would eventually acknowledge he was also their most human. And in the end, that balance was the only thing that truly mattered.